16. Wake up, Mama. Wake up. As Elvis completed his advanced tank training the next day, August 9th, 1958, Gladys was being put into an ambulance and taken to Methodist Hospital, where she'd once been a nurse's aide. Her condition was listed as grave. Vernon called Lamar. "You need to tell Elvis to get up here as quick as possible, tomorrow if he can." "He's out in the field, Vernon," Lamar said. He borrowed a jeep and went out and got him. The next day, Elvis, now frantic with the realization that Gladys could die, tried to get home. But he was set to begin basic unit training, and his captain denied emergency leave. Gladys's doctor called military personnel in Washington and stressed the urgency of the situation. But only when Elvis threatened to go AWOL did the Army grant his leave. On August 12th, Lamar flew with him from Fort Worth to Memphis, where Elvis got a cab to the house and then drove up to the hospital on his own. When he went over again the next morning, August 13th, Gladys told Elvis she was feeling better, that the doctors were saying she could go home the next day if she kept improving. He breathed a sigh of relief, kissed his mother, and went home for a few hours before returning in the afternoon. In the interim, Gladys had another visitor, Dottie Ayers, a fan who had met the family after writing Gladys a letter of support at the height of Elvis's negative press. "We were in the room talking, and they brought in some flowers and asked Gladys to sign for them. Her hands were swelled. She was swelled all over, and she asked me to sign for her. I signed Mrs. Presley and laughed and said, 'I didn't think I would ever be signing this name.' She said, 'Don't ever give up hope, honey.' Gladys looked at me, and she must have had a premonition or something. She said, 'Dottie, I don't think I'll ever see Graceland again.' I said, 'Gladys, you know the doctor said that you're better.' She said, 'I know, but I just got this awful feeling.' She said, 'Will you promise me something? Will you watch after my boy? 'Cause there's just so many people that don't care about him.'" Billy Smith went back with Elvis to the hospital later that day. They stayed until nearly midnight, Elvis patting her, asking if he could do anything for her. "Mama," he asked, "do you want me to stay the night?" "No, son. Everything's okay." "Well, I might go to the movie and then I'll come back by here." "No," Gladys said. "Just go on to the movie now and come back up here tomorrow. If I need anything, Daddy will call you." He kissed her, and then he left and picked up Frances, Gloria, and Heidi to go to the Crosstown Theater. "I don't think Elvis had any idea she would die," Billy says. "He really thought she'd get better." But Gladys knew the truth. "Son," she said, "when you come back tomorrow, make sure the other patients have these flowers." When Elvis got home, he asked Lamar to drop off the girls and told him Gladys had asked about him 2 or 3 times. But Lamar had been running back and forth, taking Minnie May up to the hospital and talking to the doctor. They drained something like 1.5 gallons of fluid off of Gladys 2 days before she died. But Elvis said, "Come with me in the morning and we'll go see her, 'cause she's going to be all right." I said to Billy, she's not going to make it through the night. Billy went up to Elvis's room, and they watched TV a little while before drifting off. Suddenly, Elvis raised himself on the bed. "Something's wrong," he said. Billy asked what he meant. "I don't know. I got an eerie feeling." Then he laid back down. It was a little after 3 a.m. on August 14th, and Vernon, sleeping in a chair at the hospital, woke up to the sound of Gladys struggling for breath. Her face was a yellow mask of fear. Gladys Love Presley, age 46, was in full cardiac arrest and would die within minutes. Shortly after, the phone rang downstairs at Graceland. Lamar was still out, and at first, Elvis just let it ring. "It's late, Billy," he finally said. "Maybe you should go down and get it." When Billy answered, "I heard Vernon say, 'Oh, God.' He was just sobbing. He said, 'Tell Elvis.' Then he really broke up. I don't know if the nurse took the phone from him or if he handed it to her, but she got on, and I could hear him crying in the background." "Tell Elvis he needs to get up here quick as he can," she said. "His mother has taken a turn for the worse." Billy ran upstairs. "That was the nurse. She said to tell you that you might ought to get up there, that your mom is starting to slip." He said, "Oh my God, no, Mama, no." I think he knew, but he didn't want to believe it. Elvis quickly pulled on his white shoes, a pair of white pants, and a white ruffled shirt. We ran downstairs and we jumped into the Lincoln Mark II, and we tore out of there like all hell had broke loose. The whole time we were driving, he said, "Oh God, I'm scared. I'm afraid I've lost my mama." When they got to the hospital, Elvis, nearly hysterical, slowed the Lincoln and jumped out, leaving the car in drive and letting it run over the breaker. Billy shoved the gear shift in park, and then he took off too, leaving the car running, the lights blazing, both doors open. Elvis was way ahead of him now, running to Gladys. Upstairs, as Elvis turned the corner, Vernon was just coming out of Gladys's room. His face hung in folds of grief. Vernon reached out his arms, and Elvis rushed toward him. "God, son, she's gone," he cried. All the color just drained out of Elvis's face, Billy remembers. He was white as a sheet. He started to sob this kind of unearthly sound. It just went through me. Father and son, so unable to show affection before, held each other and cried unashamedly in the hallway. Then Elvis broke away. "I want to see her," he said. No, son," Vernon pleaded. "Don't go in there." But Elvis wouldn't be stopped. "No, I've got to see my mama." With Billy by his side, Elvis entered the room where Gladys lay, so very still, in a pink nightgown. An oxygen tent was pulled back from her face. She had a restful look about her. Elvis leaned over and lifted her head and pressed his cheek to hers. He cried and stroked her head and then patted her on the stomach the way he had when he was a child, the two of them alone, with nothing but each other in Tupelo. "Oh, God, Satnin," he said, "not when I can give you everything in the world." He stood petting her, talking to her in their little language, until Vernon and the nurse pulled him away and took him down the hall to the waiting room. About 4 a.m., Lamar arrived back at the house in the black Cadillac. The wind was blowing, and the front door open. Minnie May came out on the porch and said, "Gladys is dead. We need to go to the hospital." "We shot over there," he remembers, "and that elevator opened, and I've never heard such crying and screaming and hollering in my life. It was unbelievable. This wailing, almost like wolves. It made me shudder. I came around the corner and Elvis was walking toward me and he said, 'Lamar, Satnin isn't here.' And I said, 'I know, Elvis, I know.'" Lamar sat with him for a long time. He wanted his mother to have an old-fashioned Southern visitation and service at home, he said, and Lamar offered to help with the arrangements. As they were on their way to the car, leaving through the loading area at the back of the hospital, the attendants brought Gladys's body down to be transported to the funeral home. He wouldn't let her go for the longest time. He was sobbing, saying, "She's all I ever lived for. She was my best girl." They sat in the car in the parking lot, both of them crying, and then they went back to Graceland so Elvis could make a few calls. One was to the base, requesting extended leave. Another was to Eddie Fadal. "Eddie," he said, his voice cracking. "She's gone. I've lost the only person I ever really loved." Eddie tried to console him, and finally Elvis choked out, "Can you come?" Elvis said yes, of course, and Elvis told him he'd send Junior to the airport to get him. The Memphis funeral home took care of the body, and then they brought Gladys back to Graceland, the house she had lived in barely a year, the mansion that had never felt like home. Elvis saw them coming up the drive. "Daddy, Mama's coming home," he called to his father. Elvis asked the attendants to put the copper and silver casket between the music room and living room, and they placed her there. Elvis walked over to where she lay in her blue dress, a glass top covering most of the body. He then asked that the lower half of the casket be opened so that he might see her feet, which were clothed in little slippers. Elvis removed them, and massaged her feet and hands, and then, taking a comb from his pocket, rearranged her hair. Lamar couldn't stand it. He got nearly hysterical, started that wailing again. It made my skin crawl. Elvis's first cousin, Harold Lloyd, heard about Gladys's death on the radio and came right up from Mississippi. Now he wondered if Elvis had lost his mind. He was in pitiful shape. His eyes were all swollen and red. He would walk over to the casket and say, "Wake up, Mama, wake up, Mama. Wake up, baby," and talk to Elvis. He kept it up, parading from the couch to the casket, pleading with her, fondling her, lapsing into baby talk. At one point, he went out on the porch and sat on the steps near one of the stone lions that guarded the entrance. Billy went to the door and watched him, saw him put his arm on his knee and bury his face. He just cried something awful. I followed him out there, but I didn't know what to say or do, so I just let him be. Afterward, he sat up almost all night and stared at her. When Eddie got there the next day, Elvis and Vernon were standing at the casket. Both of them touched the body. Like they wanted to pick her up and kiss her, Eddie thought, so he walked in quietly. Vernon was wailing, and Elvis was chanting and smoothing his mother's forehead, comforting her, comforting himself, almost going back into the womb. "Mama," he said, "you never would dress up for me, and now here you are dressed up in the most beautiful gown. I never saw you dressed up like this." Eddie felt as if he had intruded on a private moment, but then Elvis saw him and brought him up to the casket. "Mama, here's Eddie. You know Eddie. You met him in Colleen." Eddie got chills, and then Elvis took her hand. "Look, Eddie, at those hands," he said. "Those beautiful hands. They worked so hard to raise me." Anita was in New York when Gladys died, and after taping her Andy Williams program that night, she got on a plane. Lamar met her at the airport. When they pulled up at the house, Elvis and Vernon were sitting on the front porch, weeping. "Little, little, little," Elvis cried. "I've lost her, I've lost her." Anita put her arms around him, and then he pulled away and said, "Come on in. I want you to see her." She hesitated. She'd never seen a dead person before. "No, I don't think I want to go in there." But he insisted. "Yes, little, she loved you, and I want you to see her." Anita hung back, but she loved Gladys too. She was such a sweet lady. Elvis saw her weakening, so he grabbed her and brought her inside. We went in there where the coffin was, and he just talked like a baby. He called her Satnin, and he showed me her feet. She was barefooted, and her toes were painted. He talked about her feet, her little sooties, he called them. The corpse was so swollen, and he made me stand there forever just looking at her and talking to her. I broke down. It was just really sad. Very hard to get through. Dixie Locke came too, and while she was sad for Elvis, he reacted as I would have expected him to act. He was devastated, of course, and I think he wondered how he would even be able to get along without her, really. More and more people showed up as the night wore on. Barbara Pittman remembered, but as the mourners tried to console father and son, Colonel Parker burst in and tried to run everybody off. "Get all of those people out of here," he barked to no one in particular. "I want them out of here now." Elvis, in a rare moment of confrontation, rose from his seat on the couch. "Look, these are my friends. Don't you come in my house and tell me to run my friends out of here." But Parker worried he couldn't handle security at Graceland and urged Elvis to move the next day's services to the Memphis funeral home. Elvis thought about it for a minute and nodded in agreement. The attendants came to get Gladys early the next day, and Elvis, who had again stayed up all night, followed the casket all the way out to the hearse, crying, "Please don't take my baby away. Bring her back. She's not dead, she's just sleeping. Oh, God, please don't take her away." Harold Lloyd nearly broke down himself, seeing his cousin suffer so. He said, "Everything I have is gone. Everything I've ever worked for. I got all this for her, and now she's gone. I don't want any of it now." But Vernon was in a more practical frame of mind. According to Elvis's music publisher, Freddie Beanstalk, who was staying at the house. In Freddie's view, Vernon was not as broken up as he seemed. When the funeral director came to Graceland, Vernon was crying and carrying on, and it was pure bunk, because he was cheating all over the place and everybody knew it. But he was saying, through these not very convincing tears, the best of everything, give her the best of everything. The fellow marked it all down and left very quickly, and the moment he walked out the door, all the tears and crying stopped. Vernon turned to Colonel Parker and said, "Don't let them take advantage of me in my hour of grief." 3,000 fans ringed the area around the Spanish-styled Memphis funeral home on Union Avenue, many of them there to show their support, most of them hoping for a glance at Elvis. Memphis Police Captain W. Woodward, a friend of Elvis who had posed for a photo with Nick Adams the year before, stationed 150 policemen to keep order along the route to Forest Hill Cemetery, where Gladys would be buried. Reverend Hamill officiated at the funeral, and as Dixie knew he would, Elvis asked the Blackwood brothers to sing, since the revered gospel quartet was Gladys's favorite group. They arrived early for the 3:30 services to go over the songs and meet with the family. J.D. Sumner, the Blackwoods' bass singer since 1954, was astonished at Elvis's level of grief. "I've never seen a man that loved his mother as much as Elvis loved Gladys. He laid on that glass over the coffin, and I've never heard a kid scream and holler so much as Elvis did at his mother." The Blackwoods had planned on singing 3 or 4 numbers, including Take My Hand, Precious Lord, and Precious Memories, but Elvis kept scribbling down song titles and sending notes up until the quartet, worried about making their concert in South Carolina that night, performed a dozen numbers. Barbara Hearn had been on vacation in Pensacola, Florida, with her friend Anita Burns and family, when her mother called with the news. Anita's father insisted they return immediately so Barbara could attend the funeral. Anita went with her. They managed to get seats despite the crowd, and Barbara could see Elvis in the family section off to the left. But after a short time the curtain was drawn, blocking him from view. Afterward, a policeman held up the procession so Barbara could join it, and she went to Forest Hill Cemetery as part of the front end of the cortege. When everyone had left the chapel, Elvis promised James Blackwood he would charter a plane for the group that evening, and thanked him for what he had done. He put his arms around me and said, "James, you know what I am going through," referring to the airplane crash that had taken James's brother, R.W. Then he leaned over his mother's body and kissed her. "Mama," he said, "I would give every dime I have and even dig ditches just to have you back." At the cemetery, Elvis got through the brief service without incident. But then, as the mourners retreated to their hot summer cars, Elvis lost control again. As they lowered the coffin, he threw a small shovel of dirt on top and cried out inconsolably, "Goodbye, darling, goodbye. I love you so much. You know I lived my whole life just for you." Then, as everyone watched in horror, Elvis tried to jump in the ground with his mother. "They were holding him back and he was screaming," Barbara Pittman said. "It was horrible. It was really just the worst thing I had ever seen." Barbara and Anita stayed until the end of the ceremony and then drove to Graceland where Elvis and Vernon were receiving guests. Barbara was surprised to be denied entry and left her card. Later, someone called and asked her to come back out. Elvis hugged her and apologized for her experience earlier. "Of everyone," he said, "she would have wanted you here." He was in a trance. I don't think he himself could describe how he acted. Everyone was so sad. It happened so fast it was difficult to comprehend. Reverend Hamill would meet with Elvis one-on-one in the next days and weeks, but Elvis's grief was so deep that he was almost beyond reaching. Nothing, not the 200 floral arrangements, the 100,000 cards and letters, or the 500 telegrams, seemed to help. Then the Colonel spoke with May Axton, who had been like a second mother to Elvis when he was starting out. May had just gotten out of the hospital and was unable to travel. Now she wrote Elvis a letter. "I just wrote my heart and put it on a plane. Tom Diskin took the missive directly to Elvis, who holed up in his room to read it over and over. For a little while then, Elvis seemed calmer. Then he was just as shattered as before. Guests noticed that he couldn't sit still. He ambled from person to person, as if pleading with them to bring her back. And he wandered through the house, always stopping outside one door. "I can't go into my mother's room," he said. "I can't bear for anyone to go in there yet." Arlene Cogan, a tag-along fan who had met him at 14 at his Chicago press conference in 1957, couldn't believe how hard he took it. He walked around carrying Gladys's nightgown for days. He wouldn't put it down. It went with him everywhere he went. People were screaming, "Somebody please help him," Barbara Pittman remembered. Finally, Vernon called for a doctor, who disappeared with Elvis upstairs and gave him a shot to settle his nerves. He also left a bottle of pills. "I saw Elvis come down from his bedroom so stoned out of his mind he didn't know where he was," Barbara said. "He had a line of mirrors that ran along the stairs in the hallway. Elvis came down and said, 'Hey, look at all them little Elvises. 1,000 little Elvises here.' The doctor was giving him tranquilizers, and he liked him." Anita saw the pills too, but they seemed warranted at the time. He would rally, as when the Memphis Highway Patrol, trying to cheer him, took him for helicopter rides all over Memphis. Then something would happen, and he'd break down again. One day Elvis was sitting on the floor talking with some of the fans, telling stories about his army experiences, when Vernon came in the room carrying a stainless steel saucepan. Inside were 3 baseball-sized snowballs. Back in the winter, sitting at her seat at the breakfast bar, a melancholy Gladys had watched the snow fall and pile up in deep drifts by the back fence. Elvis was out of town, and more lately she'd missed her son as if he were dead. "How Elvis loves the snow," she'd said, turning to Vernon. "Do you think he will be home for Christmas?" Without a word, she went to the cupboard and took out a small pan. Then she headed for the back door to make snowballs. "I'm going to put these in the freezer and keep 'em till Elvis comes home," she'd explained. Vernon had forgotten all about them. The discovery set Elvis off again, and he was awash with regret, tormented by how tender she was, how she'd thought of him every minute, and how he'd disappointed her at times. They'd fought as hard as they'd loved, and their fights were commonplace, Gladys smacking him so hard on the back of the head sometimes, "Mama," that she nearly knocked him down. One day at Graceland, she'd started on him the minute he got up, about women, about staying out all hours. He wasn't living according to Jesus' plan, she said, and she was angry, as mad as when she'd ripped a plowshare off in her youth. Elvis took it until lunch, but then his anger bubbled over and he picked up a plate of tomatoes and threw it hard against the wall, the china shattering and fleshy red specks flying everywhere. Gladys set her jaw. "You do that again," she warned, "and your life will be miserable from here on out." At the time, he worried about breaking her dishes and ruining her walls. But now he saw she didn't care about that. All she wanted was him, the way they used to be, before he belonged to everyone. "Funny," he told a reporter 4 years later. "She never really wanted anything fancy. She just stayed the same, all the way through the whole thing. There's a lot of things happened since she passed away that I wish she could have been around to see. It would have made her very happy and very proud. But that's life, and I can't have her." Gladys Love Presley had been an ordinary countrywoman, but she had brought greatness into this world. She had shaped a man who made a difference, who helped create a musical art form. Through that, he had united disparate people, changed sexual mores, and harnessed a burgeoning youth culture. No one would ever forget him or her. On August 24th, 10 days after his mother's passing, Elvis went back to Fort Hood to rejoin his unit. Just before he left the house, he went to Gladys's door. "I got to go, Mama," he said, and broke down once more. Then he told his father and Alberta that nothing was to be moved in Gladys's room while he was away. He wanted it to remain exactly as she had left it, preserved as if she were still alive, as if he might find her there when he returned from overseas. In a month, he would be in Germany, assigned to the 3rd Armored Division and stationed in Friedberg. But Elvis was not ready to go back to Killeen, let alone go to Europe. It was all too soon for a trauma of such magnitude. Gladys's death had not just been the passing of his mother and his best friend, but psychologically, Elvis had experienced a double death. The forfeiture of his twin and the immediate loss of his mother were inextricable, compressing 23 years of shock and emptiness into a single moment. His extraordinary keening had been a manifestation of stuck grief for Jessie, and now new anguish for Gladys that he would never surmount. Psychologists call this the premorbid personality, or the underlying structure that, given something apocalyptic, triggers all the pathology and pushes it to the surface, says Dr. Peter O. Whitmer, an expert on the twinless twin phenomenon. When Gladys died, so too did Elvis's ability to bond with a woman. He may have gotten close at times, but he was already taken, as so many twinless twins are. In Killeen, Elvis tried to pick up where he had left off. Eddie Fadal invited him out every weekend, but nothing was really right. Colonel Parker told him to stay away from Eddie, that he was a homosexual with designs on him. Linnell, too, was tired of all the commotion, weary of having to cook for Elvis and his gang. Later, Janice Fadal, who would grow up to marry Lamar Fike in a short-lived union, would realize that her mother had resented Elvis. Once I saw a bunch of limos pull up, and I ran screaming through the house, "Elvis is here!" Dad was excited, but Mom freaked out. He became my father's focus, instead of us, the family. Still, everybody tried to put on a bright face when they got together and told funny stories about Elvis's early touring days in Texas, when Elvis signed women's breasts in Lubbock, and the girls put Band-Aids over the signatures to protect them in the shower. At some point that summer, Elvis and Rex and a few of the guys drove to Dallas to girl watch at the Sheraton and the Quality Inn. Then they learned about the American Airlines Stewardess College in Fort Worth. When they showed up, the house mother, Ronnie Anagnostis, got on the PA, "Girls, guess what? Elvis Presley is coming through the front door." The only thing they didn't do was fly over the balcony, she said. But things were never quite the same again at Fort Hood, according to Rex Mansfield. We all suffered with and for Elvis's great loss. Soon the whole gang began to visit, because Elvis seemed to need them. Arlene Cogan went down, and Francis Forbes, and fan club presidents from Chicago and elsewhere. They all stayed with Elvis, joining Lamar, Vernon, Minnie Mae, Red, and Elvis's cousins, Gene Jr. and Earl Greenwood. Sometimes there were 12 in all sleeping at the house, while outside, a crowd of 100 kept vigil. When Anita arrived on the weekends, she was distraught to find so many people in the house, especially women. It was bedlam. I could not believe it. They were all over the place. Every time I went down, there were different people there, strangers. I'd never seen those people. Elvis didn't act like himself. He would play the piano and look around. "Little, where are you?" She thought he was too intimate with them, that they were taking advantage of him. "I don't like to sit alone too much and think," he said by way of explanation. But Anita felt uneasy and wondered how it boded for their future. On September 19th, 1958, Elvis packed his things and put on his military attire to leave Fort Hood. At 7 p.m., a troop train would take him and 1,360 other soldiers to the Brooklyn Army Terminal in New York, where they would sail to Germany on the USS Randall. Before he left the house, he asked Eddie to lead the group in a word of prayer. They all got down on their knees and held hands in a circle, and after Eddie spoke, each one took his turn. "There wasn't a dry eye in the group," Eddie recalled. Afterward, he rode with Elvis and Anita in the Lincoln. "Eddie," Elvis said softly, "I really feel this is the end of my career. Everybody is going to forget about me." A light rain was falling, and a reporter approached him as he waved goodbye to Anita, Eddie, and the fan club presidents. Everybody had tears in their eyes, including Elvis. "How do you feel?" the reporter asked. "I just feel sad," Elvis said. There were people to catch his attention along the way, though. In Memphis, during a refueling stop, Alan and George came to see him, and while Elvis wasn't allowed to get off the train, George introduced him to a pretty Mississippi girl named Janie Wilbanks, who climbed up the steps in her white leather coat as Elvis leaned down for a kiss. And somewhere, as the train wound through New England, Elvis became reacquainted with the 5'3" Charlie Hodge, who hailed from Alabama and played country gospel with an outfit called the Foggy River Boys. Elvis had once met him briefly backstage at a Red Foley show in Memphis, just before they were both drafted. When the train pulled into Brooklyn at 9 a.m., a band was playing Elvis songs. The RCA execs were there, including Ann Fulcino, the national publicity director who'd taught Elvis how to eat pork chops. Immediately, Private Presley, stunningly handsome in his uniform and 10 pounds lighter than he'd been before basic training, disappeared into a conference with the colonel and a much-decorated wedge of Army officials. He emerged to a firestorm of flashbulbs, then kissed a whack for the cameras, and sat down to a large bank of microphones and an eager throng of press. What if rock and roll should die out while he was in the service? "I'll starve to death," he quipped. How did he feel about being sent to Europe? "I'd like to go to Paris and look up Brigitte Bardot." What's his idea of the ideal girl? "Female, sir." Everybody laughed. "I suppose I'll know if I ever find someone that I really fall in love with." He was handling it all so deftly. The men from RCA beamed and nodded approvingly, and Ann Fulcino felt a wave of pride. He had come so far so fast, and grown from a green amateur to a confident star in 2 years. It was amazing, really. Then, carrying a shoebox that Parker had handed him, Elvis waved to the crowd, hoisted a borrowed duffel bag to his shoulders, and climbed the gangplank of the USS Randall. By now, the band had played Tutti Frutti 3 times. Elvis stopped at the rail of the ship and lifted the lid on the shoebox. The boat began making its metallic creak, and then started its slow pull from the harbor. With that, Elvis emptied the box, and thousands of little Elvis images poured down the side of the boat and onto the pier, disappearing into the frantic hands of female admirers. 17. Fräulein Fallout. When the boat docked at Bremerhaven shortly before 9 a.m. on October 1st, 1958, Elvis, the rock and roll matador, as the Germans called him, received the same frenzied media attention that had surrounded his send-off in America. But the 1,500 German fans who turned out were greatly subdued in comparison to the screaming throngs in the States. So the media engaged in a bit of manipulation. Photographers from the teen magazine Bravo stage-managed pictures to show MPs struggling to hold back an eager crowd, and newsreel cameramen encouraged the bravest youngsters to feats of daring. 16-year-old Karl Heinz, who didn't even own an Elvis record, was goaded into rushing up the gangplank to get Elvis's first autograph in Europe. But as Elvis shifted his 65-pound duffel bag to scrawl his name, he nearly lost his balance. Finally, he shook his head, sorry, and moved on down to board the troop train, which would take him 200 miles to Friedberg, population 18,000. Elvis's permanent army post was the Friedberg Kaserne, better known as Ray Barracks, home to the 32nd Hell on Wheels Battalion of the 3rd Armored Division. The long, bleak rows of brick buildings had formerly housed Hitler's SS troops and made an unwelcome sight as the train pulled in about 7:30 that evening, delivering Elvis and his battalion directly to the base. There, Elvis found high fences, well-guarded gates, and another barrage of media. "I'm just a plain soldier like anyone else," he said. Initially assigned as a jeep driver to Company D, Elvis would soon be transferred to Company C, a scout platoon often sent out on maneuvers. His primary duty would be to drive a jeep for Reconnaissance Platoon Sergeant Ira Jones, the military hoping the assignment would keep him out of the public eye. 3 days after his press conference on October 2nd, classical music is just great to go to sleep by, the Army closed the base to the media. Just as Elvis was settling into the Spartan Ray barracks, with its steel-framed beds and cold linoleum floors, Lamar, Red, Vernon, and Minnie May, following through on a promise she made to Gladys on her deathbed, arrived in Germany. For a few days after Elvis left Fort Hood, it looked as though there might be a delay in getting the family matriarch overseas. Vernon had relied upon his attorney to verify Minnie May's date of birth, which was necessary for her to secure her passport, but no record of her birth was readily available. It took 75 cents worth of gasoline to drive through the backwoods of Arkansas to find a cousin who could supply the information, recalled Frank Glankler, a senior partner in the Memphis firm that represented the Presleys. When we finally found the house, there was a goat on the front porch. The cousin didn't want to sign the affidavit because he couldn't read. He was afraid he might be signing away the deed to his house. In the end, he gave us his ex. Now, on October 4th, after an 18-hour flight from New York to Frankfurt, the Presley family drove to Bad Homburg and checked into the Ritter's Park Hotel, a resort spa that offered thermal baths as palliative care for patients with bad hearts and respiratory ailments. Elvis joined his family for dinner at the hotel as the crowd collected outside. Within days, Elvis got permission to live off base with his dependents, i.e. Vernon and Minnie May, and moved the entire group to the Hilbert's Park Hotel in Bad Neuheim, an old-world, cobblestoned spa town of 14,000 people. There, they occupied 4 rooms on the 3rd floor. On weekends, Charlie Hodge came up from his post 10 miles away. The two were close now, having bonded during the crossing. Charlie had been a regular on the Ozark Jubilee TV show, so he and Elvis knew the same country stars. Elvis asked a lot about Wanda Jackson, the same gospel stars, and the same songs. They'd put on a talent show on the ship, Elvis playing piano but not singing. And after he was assigned to sergeant's quarters, his fellow GIs wouldn't leave him alone. He requested that Charlie be allowed to bunk with him. It helped stave off his loneliness and the pain of losing his mother. Despite his father, grandmother, and Anita, he felt totally alone in the world. Just before he left, another GI had given him a little book, an anthology, poems that touch the heart. He read the pieces about motherhood and death over and over until he finally drifted off to sleep. I could hear Elvis dreaming sometimes at night, and I'd get out of my bunk and sit down and start talking to him, maybe joke with him a little bit, get him in a little better mood. He said years later, "Charlie, if it hadn't been for you," he said, "you kept me sane all the way across the ocean." Each morning, Elvis left early for the base, traveling by taxi or hitching a ride from Sergeant Jones. He was back by 6 p.m., except on Fridays, when he helped clean the barracks. His was number 3707 on the ground floor, and latrines for Saturday's inspection. But 3 weeks later, the group moved again. Someone more famous than Elvis now occupied the hotel. Oil Sheikh Ibn Saud, the king of Saudi Arabia, who arrived with his harem of wives, a dozen children, and an assorted entourage, all in Bedouin gear. The king handed out gold watches instead of autographs, and Elvis felt upstaged, as Lamar saw it. He didn't like it that the king attracted all that attention. And so the Presley camp rented the top floor of Bad Nauheim's elegant and luxurious Hotel Grunwald, a small 3-story family establishment festooned with ornamental spires, located at Theresienstrasse 10. Everyone but Red and Lamar, who shared a room, had his own quarters, decorated with antique furniture and crystal chandeliers. The wealthy clientele was elderly. Red said they all looked like they had one foot in the grave and the other one on a roller skate, but Elvis was happy there. "We put in a kitchen," Lamar recalls, and Elvis rented a separate room just for the bags of mail. Soon he would receive between 5,000 and 10,000 letters a week. Among them would be almost daily missives from Colonel Parker. He typed them himself, using the hunt and peck method, apprising Elvis and Vernon of all his hard work and bragging about his efforts. Before Elvis sailed for Europe, Parker promised him he would be a bigger star when he came home than he had been when he left. Already, the manager had negotiated new contracts with 20th Century Fox and Paramount for huge increases in fees, $150,000 more than what Elvis would have gotten under the original contract at Paramount, he crowed. The Colonel couldn't travel to Europe because, as an illegal alien, he had no passport, but even from afar, he ruled with an iron hand. When Elvis told him Anita Wood was planning to come for an extended visit, Parker insisted she stay home. The press would have them engaged or getting married, and Elvis didn't need that kind of publicity, especially not now. On October 28, 1958, Elvis wrote Anita a 3-page letter on Hotel Grunwald stationery. He called her often. Weird hours, very late because the time change was so different. But this was his first letter to her from Europe, and his first ever in 100 years, he said. But there were so many things he wanted to tell her and couldn't say over the phone, he wrote, his handwriting making big loops of his T's and Y's. His words were intensely romantic, Elvis lapsing into predictable lover's language about how much he missed her, and saying he kept her picture by his bed. But then, after insisting, "I haven't dated a single girl since I have been here," he took on a serious tone. "I want to explain something to you, and you have got to trust me and believe me because I am very sincere when I say it. I will tell you this much. I have never and never will again love anyone like I love you, sweetheart. Also, I guarantee that when I marry, it will be Miss Little Presley Wood. There is a lot you have to understand, though. Only God knows when the time will be right. So you have to consider this and love me. Trust me and keep yourself clean and wholesome, because that is the big thing that can determine our lives and happiness together. No matter what I'm doing, whether it be the army, making movies, traveling, or singing, I will be thinking of the time when we have our first little Elvis Presley. So keep this in mind and don't get discouraged and lonely. Just remember this is a guy that loves you with all his heart and wants to marry you." Such demonstrative words must have been a comfort to Anita, except what Elvis didn't mention was that on October 5th, while showing his family around a park in Bad Homburg, 23-year-old Elvis had met 16-year-old Margit Bergen, a pretty blonde stenographer for an electrical company in Frankfurt. It had happened as soon as they left the Ritter's Park Hotel that evening, when a group of shutterbugs from the German tabloids descended on us like a horde of locusts, in the Mars words. Robert Lebeck, well known for his photographs of politicians and show business personalities, had asked the petite beauty to come with him, thinking a pose of the most famous American GI with an attractive German girl would make a saleable picture. Lebeck asked Elvis to kiss her, and Elvis obliged, and then wanted more. He began seeing her immediately. Elvis was so smitten with her that he mentioned her in his one letter to Alan Fortis, which he wrote from maneuvers in Grafenwöhr, Bavaria, on November 14th. "I have been dating this little German chuckleoid by the name of Margit. She looks a lot like Bibi, Brigitte Bardot. It's Grind City, a steamy affair." The German papers made a big splash of the couple, and soon she was the most talked-about woman in the country, receiving dozens of letters a day. "She's blonde and has blue eyes," Elvis told an Armed Forces Network reporter. "I've seen her about 5 times already, which is more than any other girl around here." He bought her a wristwatch, and she showed it off in the press. Elvis called her Little Puppy. Back in Memphis, the other Little blinked at what she read. She could believe that reporters made up quotes sometimes, as Elvis always told her. But Anita's face flushed when she saw the pictures of him with his arms around another blonde, holding her close and looking deeply into her eyes. She fired off 3 letters to him about her disappointment. "Well, I can't blame you," Elvis quickly answered, "especially since that mess was written about Little Puppy and all that horseshit." He then explained how they met, that she was a photographer's model, and a newsman had brought her over the first week he was in Germany. "I have seen her 1 time since then," he lied, his letter postmarked on the same day he told Alan about his affair. "I have not been dating her, and I have not tried to keep anything from you. Every night I lay in my bunk, I see your little eyes and your little nose, and it's almost like you are here, like you are pressed up close to me. I can feel your little hair on the side of my face, and sometimes I get so excited and want you so bad I start sweating. Wow." In closing, he told her their song from now on was "Please Love Me Forever" by Tommy Edwards. "Every night I play it just for you," Elvis wrote. But he was also playing the record for Margit. He was seeing her several times a week now, either in Bad Nauheim or at the home she shared with her mother in Frankfurt-Eschersheim. He drove the 30 miles alone in his white BMW 507, parking his car in the American Forces Network lot, with the staff instructed not to bother him. As the relationship wore on, he sent a taxi driver, Joseph Wareheim, to Frankfurt for her twice a month. Elvis and Margit went to the movies, to the Frankfurt Zoo, talked in back corners of nightclubs where they could hold hands undisturbed. He particularly liked La Parisienne, and cuddled at the parties Elvis held at the hotel. They were known to spend the night together on several occasions in both cities, but the romance was hampered by the fact that Margit spoke only minimal English, and so they communicated in other ways. "He is shy and rarely speaks about himself," the teenager told reporter Mike Tomkes about her boyfriend. "He's not at all conceited. He doesn't like to go out often. We spend evenings listening to pop records, or he would play the piano and sing folk songs. He plays the guitar and says as little as possible about his success as a singer." But if Elvis was modest, Margit was eager for attention and posed for cheesecake shots published in Overseas Weekly, the American GI magazine. Look magazine, too, would feature them together, Margit saying, "He's so different from what I thought he'd be." Elvis was embarrassed. It put him in more of a jam with Anita, and he felt exploited. "She went and got herself pin-up pictures made," Red said at the time, "and spread them all over the front pages as Elvis Presley's German Fräulein. Elvis doesn't like that. It made him mad. He certainly liked her a lot, but after that he never saw her again." Lamar remembers it differently. "Elvis dated her on and off the whole time he was in Germany, but the heavy stuff lasted about 2 months. Then he got tired of her and went to somebody else." When Memphis disc jockey Keith Sheriff asked him about her in a phone interview in early 1959, Elvis replied, "Don't get me wrong. She's a cute little girl and all of that, but it's mostly a lot of publicity." Margit did not take it well. "I feel mad and humiliated," she complained. "All the girls who envied me so are now busy making jokes about Presley's ex-girlfriend." Years after their relationship, Margit would suggest that it was she who broke things off, because Elvis insisted that he belonged to his fans, and therefore could not consider marriage. "I'm a corporation, not a man," he told her. "Sure, I want to get married and have kids, but for me, it's impossible." Late in the fall, when Elvis was still involved with Margit, he received a call from Deveda D. Elliott Stanley, the wife of Bill Stanley, a much-decorated American master sergeant stationed in Frankfurt. Dee, the mother of 3 young boys, Billy, Ricky, and David, was unhappy in her marriage. Her husband, who had been one of General George S. Patton's drivers, was a mean drunk, and Dee found Elvis a delicious diversion. She invited him to dinner with her family, but Elvis had a good excuse. He was about to go to Grafenwöhr, on the Czech border, for 6 weeks of reconnaissance maneuvers. He'd be up to his elbows in snow. However, Vernon, who was growing a Boston Blackie mustache, offered himself as a stand-in for a coffee date. Dee, a bottle blonde given to showy clothing, had a come-hither tone in her voice that let him know she would make it worth his while. The fact that she was married didn't faze him, since he'd been carrying on his own escapades for years, and had begun fooling around with at least 2 women in Killeen in the days after Gladys's death. For her part, Dee wanted anyone who was close to Elvis. "Boy," says Lamar, "she stalked him like prize game." Like Elvis, Vernon, who started hanging out in the little bars around Bad Nauheim, drinking vodka or bourbon and coke, and buying rounds for women at Elvis's expense, could compartmentalize sex and love. Before coming overseas, he and his son had gone to the Memphis Memorial Studio and ordered an enormous monument for Gladys's grave, replete with Italian statuary, a towering cross with a beckoning Jesus and attendant angels. In November, they were proud to learn that the accompanying marker had been completed. The inscription, "She was the sunshine of our home." On November 20th, 1958, Elvis and Rex Mansfield went to the movies at the Post Theater in Grafenwöhr, which was often their habit. Rex, from the little town of Dresden, Tennessee, 120 miles north of Memphis, remained Elvis's closest army buddy. They'd been inducted together, gone through basic together, and traveled on the same train to New York and shipped to Germany. Elvis called him Rexodus. There wasn't much they hadn't shared. Waiting at the theater that night was a 19-year-old German girl, Elizabeth Stefaniak, the modest and well-groomed stepdaughter of an American sergeant. Elizabeth was infatuated with everything about Elvis: his looks, his music, his voice, his movies, and his celebrity status. She'd read in Stars and Stripes that Elvis went to the theater every night in Grafenwöhr, entering after the lights went down, and leaving shortly before the movie was over. She saw it as her chance to get an autograph. When she got there, all the GIs were coming in, and in their crew cuts they all looked the same, so I asked the manager and he told me approximately where they were sitting. I saw one soldier who was sitting in that area get up, and he came back to get some popcorn. I was waiting in the lobby in the dark, and I asked him, "Are you sitting anywhere near Elvis?" And he said, "Yes, in fact, I'm sitting right next to him." I said, "Would you please just get me an autograph?" And he said, "Sure," and went back inside. Moments later, Rex appeared and told her that Elvis would like her to come down and sit with him. Elvis took a shine to the dark-haired girl, finding her body, as he would later tell Joe Esposito, voluptuous. He walked her home that evening and surprised her with a goodnight kiss. For the next 6 nights, she met him at the theater, and then he dropped in at her apartment unexpectedly for Thanksgiving and met her parents. Everything was yes ma'am and no ma'am, Elizabeth remembers. They were very impressed. He talked about his mother, of course, but surprisingly, the only time Elizabeth saw tears in his eyes was when he talked about his father. He was hurt that his mother had just passed away and his father was already dating. After that first visit to her apartment, he came every day, often at odd times, sometimes for meals or talks with the family, and sometimes to take Elizabeth to the movies. Her family felt comfortable with him, and he liked the close, homey atmosphere. When his maneuvers were over and he was about to return to Bad Nauheim, he gave her parents a 365-day gold clock. Elvis and Elizabeth's stepfather, Raymond Mac McCormick, spent hours putting it together. It was a calculated gift, of course. He told Elizabeth's parents he had about 50 duffel bags of fan mail, and he needed a secretary who could read and write both German and English. Elizabeth was perfect for the job, since she had lived in the States for a time and was fluent in both languages. She could stay in her own private room at the Hotel Grunwald, he told them. "I assure you that she will be in good hands with me and my father and grandmother, and we will take full responsibility for her." "You think about it," he said to Elizabeth as he left. "You don't have to give me an answer now, darling. I'll call you in a couple of days." But she didn't have to think about it, and neither did her parents. Elvis had said her duties would start at the first of the year, but 3 days later he called and asked how soon she could come. "I can be there in 1 week," she told him, and arrived on the train the first part of December. Bad Nauheim was 351 kilometers from Grafenwöhr, or 218 miles, and she'd never been away from her parents for any real length of time, or even taken a train ride that far by herself. It was all a great adventure. Vernon, Lamar, and Red picked her up at the station and drove her to the Hotel Grunwald, and on the way, Vernon explained that she would be working for him, not Elvis, at a salary of $35 a week, paid on Fridays. Minnie May would be her foremost companion. The old woman, who perpetually parked a toothpick in the side of her mouth for dipping snuff, was looking forward to some female companionship, and she insisted that the teen call her Grandma. Elizabeth thought she had a grand sense of humor. We hit it off that night, and I knew we would be great friends. She accepted me right away like one of the family. But Elizabeth wasn't precisely sure what her relationship was with Elvis, since they'd only kissed in Grafenvohr. That first evening, he made it clear. He came downstairs to her room and said he would be spending the night with her. Elvis saw a look of worry cross her face and told her not to be concerned, that he didn't have full intercourse with girls he was going to see on a regular basis, because he didn't want to run the risk of getting her pregnant. Such a risk would damage his reputation and image, Elizabeth remembers him saying. That first night we sort of played around. Over the course of the next weeks and months, I went to bed with him almost every night. He called her Foghorn because her voice was so low in the mornings, and she took it as a term of endearment. She worked hard on answering the mail, practicing his signature for a week, though eventually reverting to a rubber stamp. But she also wondered how long she would be on the job, or even if he would continue to be her lover. As she soon learned, no woman could hold Elvis Presley's attention for very long. Only days after her arrival, he took another girl to bed, and after he dispatched Lamar to drive her home, he knocked 3 times on the wall between their bedrooms, signaling Elizabeth to come to him. At first, she had her reservations about seeing him at all. He was still involved with Margit, and often Elizabeth had to be the translator between them, which hurt her heart. He was the man I adored, and the last thing I was interested in was helping their relationship blossom. She would hear him with other girls through the walls too, and even if she thought he was not doing any more with them than he was with her, it made her feel empty inside. There would be at least a couple of girls each week, more on weekends. These were often very beautiful girls, but although I resented them, I knew they were not staying. I did not let him see me cry, and all the time I was telling myself how lucky I was. Elvis never apologized or tried to explain his actions. I guess he never felt he owed me an explanation. I do remember the pain of getting into bed with him maybe 10 or 20 minutes after another girl had left. Many times we never made love. He would sometimes just give me a good-night kiss and go to sleep. It was like a comfort thing for him. Elizabeth could see that the combination of events, his mother's death, his father's fling with a married woman, his being away from home, friends, and family back in the States, and the potential loss of his career, served to make a private, much darker Elvis emerge during his time in Germany. His hot flash temper seemed nearer the surface, mostly when he would say harsh things to you. I never saw him throw things at me, but he could say some hurtful things. The worst of it came one day on a shopping trip. There were things he needed for himself, and he wanted to buy Elizabeth some clothes. While they were out, he picked a waste can he wanted for his bathroom. I said, "Elvis, you already have a basket in your bathroom." Well, that was the wrong thing to say. He turned to me and said, "Don't you ever tell me what to buy or not to buy. If I want to buy 1,000 trash cans." It was an awkward moment, a terrible moment, and when they walked out of the store, he was still angry. "I was going to buy you some clothes, but you ticked me off," he told her. Then for 2 days he didn't speak to me very much. She never got the wardrobe, but Rex put such behavior down to his friend's natural complexity, now exacerbated by his pressures, including the expectation of being the perfect soldier, one who could never grumble or gripe like any other GI. He had no real way to blow off steam when he was tired, discouraged, upset, lonesome, or bored. The press would have a field day with it, and Colonel Parker would have threatened to leave him, the last thing Elvis wanted when he was so insecure about his future. He bought a Grundig tape recorder to make some home recordings, Danny Boy, Mona Lisa, thinking music would be his outlet. But Rex thought it was more than just situational circumstances, that Elvis was in a serious psychological slide. Elvis, Rex said, had 2 definite and distinct personalities. He was promoted to private first class during the holidays, the Army saying he was a soldier of above normal capability. But since it was his first Christmas without his mother, he was not in much of a mood to celebrate. It was dismal, as Lamar remembers. They set up a tree, and everybody went through the motions of giving presents. But it didn't seem like Christmas, not even when Elvis sang an affecting rendition of Silent Night for the other soldiers. The guys bought some fireworks to cheer him, and Elvis, caught up in the moment, blasted German civilians from the balcony of the Hotel Grunwald, which got him in trouble with the owner, Herr Otto Schmidt. They were already on thin ice. Red had accidentally shot Herr Schmidt with a spring-loaded stopper gun, leaving a wooden stick dangling from a suction cup on his forehead. And Elvis had been reprimanded for other crazy stunts: water gun duels, wrestling matches, and noisy pillow fights in the hallways. Then Lamar bought a cane to torment an old lady who beat her own cane on the ceiling to tell them to pipe down. It liked to drove her crazy. She'd pound on that ceiling like there was no tomorrow, and I'd beat back on the floor like there was no tonight. But the worst of it was when they nearly set fire to the hotel. In the middle of a shaving cream fight, Elvis locked himself in his room, and Red put a paper soaked with lighter fluid under the door and lit it. It coaxed Elvis out all right, but smoke billowed out into the hallway, alarming the ultra-conservative guests. That prompted an eviction notice, as well as a cautionary letter from Colonel Parker. It was time for Elvis to find his own house. 18. House Full of Trouble. In February 1959, Vernon found a white 3-story, 5-bedroom stucco house for rent at 14 Goethestrasse in Bad Nauheim. By American standards, the home was not well appointed or extraordinary, but it suited Elvis's needs, mostly because it was roomy enough to accommodate his family and friends. 2 bathrooms, a large living room, a glassed-in porch off the kitchen, and a basement for storage. The house also offered a retreat from the restrictions of hotel life and separated him from the image of elitism associated with the Grunwald. Now he could maintain his posture as a regular GI, living off base with his dependents. The downside was that he paid an exorbitant rent, roughly $800 a month, at least 5 times the going rate. However, the landlady, the obstinate and rotund Frau Piper, a bitch and a half in Lamar's view, knew that she could command it and made hay of her opportunity. Moreover, as part of the deal, she insisted on staying there as the housekeeper, mostly to keep an eye on her tenants and her property. Fans kept a constant vigil, some camping out in tents 100 yards from the house, others covering the wooden fence with lipstick confessions of torrid desire. When he sings, one girl said, gold comes out of his hot throat. Even a house as large as Frau Piper's could not always accommodate 2 female heads, however, and Frau Piper and Minnie May, who shopped together, cooked together, and drank together in local cafes, often butted heads. They made quite a pair, one tall and skinny and cursing in English, the other short and fat and cursing in German, chasing each other around the house with a broom. Then they'd make up and swap recipes, Minnie May learning to fix Wiener Schnitzel, and Frau Piper serving up a plate of Southern cat-head biscuits. Lamar found it hilarious. Frau Piper mouthed off to her one day, and Grandma threw a skillet at her. She missed her that time, but later on she decked her. Elvis offered to rent her an apartment, but she refused. Then Lamar threw a firecracker under her bed, but Frau Piper was not moving. She now had romantic designs on Vernon and couldn't keep her hands off Elvis either. When she'd catch him in a bear hug, he'd smile and hurl insults at her. "Get away from me, you fat slob," knowing she hadn't a clue what he'd said. When Frau Piper asked Elizabeth to translate, she covered for him. "He said you looked nice today." Elvis left the house at 5:30 each morning to report for duty, which meant he was up by 4:30 for breakfast at 5. But since he was hosting parties or playing music with Charlie and Red until late into the night, he had rented a piano and was trying to expand his vocal range. He found it hard to stay awake. A sergeant in Grafenvar gave him amphetamines on maneuvers, but he was out of them now, and he went in search of a pharmacy mate who could get Dexedrine, his mother's drug of choice, in quart-size bottles. It was amazing what money and fame could do, and almost no one said no to Elvis. He seemed to do everything to excess these days, from buying uniforms, as many as 100, to betting girls. Pills were no exception. If Elvis got up at dawn, everyone had to get up at dawn, so all the guys took Dexedrine to match his schedule and energy level. He assured Rex the pills wouldn't hurt him. "Truck drivers back in the States use these all the time to stay awake on long trips," he told them. The only side effects were good ones. Dexedrine was an appetite suppressant, and doctors prescribed it to overweight people every day. Plus, uppers increased your sex drive, gave you pocket rockets. He washed his down with hot coffee for an extra caffeine jolt, he said, and recommended Rex do the same. After taking my first pill, Rex later wrote in his memoir, Sergeant Presley, Our Untold Story of Elvis's Missing Years. I actually felt the hair on my head standing up and a surge of energy bolting through my body. Elvis was completely right about one thing. That white pill provided me with an abundance of strength and energy I didn't know I had. I could take them and stay awake an entire weekend. I was astonished that after taking only one pill, I could easily go 24 hours without food or sleep, and they were harmless. Anytime Rex ran out, Elvis handed him 100. Vernon knew about the amphetamines and on occasion took them himself. Elizabeth, too, was aware of them, as Elvis gave her some on the nights they went to the shows and clubs in Frankfurt. He particularly liked the Holiday on Ice extravaganza, as he'd become enamored of several of the skaters, who numbered among the women who came home with him. Beautiful girls were constantly coming and going, Elizabeth found. I had to painfully accept this, and just grin and bear it. With Gladys's death, says Lamar, he just let loose sexually. He was after everything he could get. I watched it change. But he had no compunction about that kind of stuff. To him, it was just banging. He had absolutely no guilt and no trouble balancing his behavior with his religious beliefs. Hit-and-run sex, then, was a way for Elvis to shut out his grief, forfeit his past, and quell his inhibitions. He was the most famous man on the planet, a millionaire several times over, with the world at his feet. But he had lost the only thing in life he truly loved. It was as if the devil himself had set a price for him to pay. But the excitement and arousal of a young girl made a lot of things go away. The Assembly of God Church, Judge Marion Gooding, and his regret over Dixie and June. In the dark, skin on skin, everything felt good and right. It made him feel alive. It made him feel that Satnin was still alive, and he could pat on her and call her baby. That's all he knew, and that's all he wanted to know for the moment. Several of the guys, especially Rex, felt sorry for Elizabeth and wondered about the cruelty and callousness with which Elvis paraded girls in front of her. Sometimes she looked like she was about to cry, Rex later wrote. She was completely in love with Elvis, and it was deflating and degrading for her to spend all day answering his love letters and then hear his muffled moans with others through the walls. Near the end of 1958, he had told her that a girl named Janie Wilbanks was coming to visit, and he wanted Elizabeth to make her feel at home, even share her office bedroom. Janie had been the girl George Klein introduced him to at the train refueling in Memphis. George had only just met her himself that day, when she walked up to him at the station. Even George was taken with her. I don't know if she went to Ole Miss at the time, but she was a typical Ole Miss beautiful girl. And he figured Elvis would like her too. She had coal-black eyes. A photographer had captured their kiss and put it on the newswire. But more important, Elvis had called George 2 weeks later saying, "Who in the hell was that girl? Man, she was good-looking. Tell her to send me some pictures and write to me." That December, she came to Germany to see her uncle, an army captain, and stayed with Elvis for a week. Elizabeth was insanely jealous, but ended up making friends with the pretty 18-year-old, as they both realized they were just two of the thousands of girls vying for his affections. The next glint in his eye was an 18-year-old actress, the delicate, green-eyed Vera Cheshova, whom he'd met in January 1959 while doing publicity pictures for Confidential magazine, building on a session he'd done in late 1958 for the March of Dimes. In this latest calculation of the Colonel to keep Elvis in the public eye, Elvis posed with a young polio victim, Robert Stephen Marquette, the son of Master Sergeant John Marquette, stationed in Friedberg. Robert wore leg braces and was confined to a wheelchair. In the first session, Elvis was photographed bending down next to the chair, his hand on Robert's, his hat on the boy's head. In another picture from that same session, the two plaintively held a sign that said, "Give." But a third photo, taken in January, involved Vera, who had just made a film in America and who conveniently spoke English. Now, only 13 years after the end of World War II, it seemed a perfect moment of German-American alliance. Vera and Elvis stood on either side of Robert, Vera holding one of the boys' hands and Elvis the other. But the way Elvis looked at the comely brunette, Robert might as well have not been in the room. Vera was far more worldly than Margit Bergen. Her grandfather was the nephew of Anton Chekhov, the famous Russian playwright, and her grandmother, Olga, one of the most popular stars of the silent film era. A favorite of Adolf Hitler, she always called him the Führer, Olga was reputedly a Russian agent in Nazi Germany. They had handwritten notes from Hitler on their walls in Munich, says Lamar. Vera's mother, Ada, was likewise an actress in films, and Vera was following in their footsteps. She had just been voted Germany's #1 pinup girl, with some 65 fan clubs, and the German papers were keen to turn her slight involvement with Elvis into a romance, whether it really blossomed into one or not. When interviewed about Elvis in the 1970s, Vera seemed to find the entire subject distasteful, beginning with the notion of posing with Elvis and a disabled boy. Her involvement with the photographs came about because somehow they were missing a woman to be used like parsley or trimming. "We took these horrible pictures," she said. "What terrible trash. The child bound to a wheelchair, and Elvis standing with the child. I was somewhere with the nervous parents. I talked a little bit with him, not much, just a couple of sentences." Vera was a strange girl, in Lamar's view. The longer you were around her, the crazier she got. He warned Elvis to stay away from her, he says, but Elvis, who called her Kitty Cat for the shape and color of her eyes, was intent on pursuing her. Once Elvis had her in his crosshairs, there was no turning him back. In early March, he got a 3-day pass and went to Munich to see her, planning also to take in the nightclubs with Red and Lamar. The driver, Joseph Verheim, motored them over in Elvis's new 300 Mercedes 4-door sedan, and they accepted an invitation to stay with the Tschechovas in Obermenzing. A photographer from Bild Zeitung, Germany's answer to the National Enquirer, accompanied Elvis and Vera on their dates. According to Lamar, the magazine had already photographed the two in Bad Nauheim at the Hotel Grunwald, and Rex remembers that she invited the whole group to a local movie theater to see one of her films, Elizabeth translating the dialogue. Now Vera was performing in a minor play, The Seducer, in Munich's Theater Unter der Arkaden, a small boulevard venue in the Maximilianstrasse. Elvis told Vera's mother, Ada, that he wanted to see it. "You won't understand a word of it," she said. "That doesn't matter," he replied, and then rented out the entire theater for himself and Red and Lamar. It was more of a grand romantic gesture than a practical act for a star who might be mobbed. And when Elvis sat in the front row, beaming up at her, Vera found it embarrassing and miserable to perform with only 3 people in front of the stage. Afterward, he took her mother and her theatrical friends to an expensive dinner at the Cannes restaurant, Red and Lamar tagging along. "Red and I felt funny around Vera," Lamar remembers. "It was like she was already looking down her nose at us." Vera and Ada, however, found it odd that Elvis's bodyguards, as they called them, stood around him like walls and went with him everywhere, even to the toilet. Elvis, Vera thought, was incredibly shy, a typical American middle-class boy, well-bred with a crease, no hooligan at all. But after the 3 spent the night at the Tschechovas' home, Vera was less complimentary about Red and Lamar, whom she considered uncouth. They were very ordinary, with belching and farting and everything that belongs with it. And her mother objected to their foul language, their refrigerator raids, and their penchant for putting their feet on the table. Elvis suggested his friends check into the nearby Hotel Edelweiss, where they got caught and were evicted for bringing women in through the window. Elvis, meanwhile, remained the Tschechovas' house guest. In the next 2 days, Elvis and Vera watched a Viking movie in production at the Bavaria Film Studios in Geiselgasteig and took a boat ride on Lake Starnberg, a popular recreational area. Elvis was after her, all right, Lamar remembers, but in the photographs, neither looks especially happy to be there. Elvis's trip to Munich would be far more memorable for his 3 visits to the Moulin Rouge, a strip club, where he was photographed in suggestive poses with a number of scantily clad dancers, B-girls, and hookers. In several shots, he is shown aggressively kissing 2 showgirls, the Orkowskis, first pushing one back along a stair rail, and then mashing the other against the opposite wall. He was also photographed in similar situations at another location, the Eve Bar, on his first night there. In contrast to the playful and sexy tone of Al Wertheimer's famous photograph, The Kiss, shot in Richmond, Virginia, only 3 years earlier, the German pictures, most of them taken by Rudolf Paulini, the house photographer of the Moulin Rouge, have a seedy, depraved, and somewhat pornographic feel about them. Elvis seems dazed, almost in a trance, and the women, predatory and reptilian, have a nightmarish look, as if sprung from a vampire's dream. The photographs run totally at odds with Elvis's wholesome, all-American image and are, in fact, so sensational and shocking that they might have ruined him had they been published at the time. They look, says rock critic Dave Marsh, like the answer to a question no one thought to ask. Vera found her Moulin Rouge evening unpleasant for another reason. While Red and Lamar always understood that part of their role was to protect Elvis in all ways, Vera resented how they cautioned him to reel in his behavior. They tossed a comb across the table at him and told him to straighten his hair, she said, and when he got up to sing with the band, Red reminded him that the Colonel had prohibited public performances. Even a glass of champagne was off limits, Lamar insisted, and embarrassed him, Vera thought, by suggesting he drink tomato juice instead. Yet, ironically, Elvis enjoyed more freedom in Germany than he did at any other time in his life. There are conflicting stories about how Elvis and Vera felt about each other and why they never saw each other after March. Thomas Bale, a family friend, reported that Ada Cheshova found Elvis and Vera together upstairs in Vera's bedroom and kicked him out. And Elvis was quoted in the press as saying, "Sure, I've got a new girlfriend. I've been to visit her family in Munich, but it's just good fun." Yet Vera steadfastly denied that anything romantic occurred between them. "I've got tired of all the fantastic stuff they write about Elvis and me. It seems hard to get through with the truth," and suggested that she was interested only in the publicity value of being photographed with an American rock star. She insisted that her mother asked him to leave because he had bothered our animals, canaries, dogs, and cats, long enough. Besides, he was more interested in one of the Moulin Rouge striptease girls than he was in her, Vera said. And indeed, according to Andreas Roth, author of The Ultimate Elvis in Munich book, Elvis had an affair with a Moulin Rouge dancer named Angie Zayatbauer and took the blonde to a hotel, though probably on a subsequent visit. On their one night together at the Moulin Rouge, Vera apparently left early with Walter Brandon, the songwriter, who acted as her chaperone. Elvis, she said, turned up for breakfast the next morning with bits of tinsel everywhere in his hair and his eyebrows. She asked him where he had been, and he said only, "I stayed there." He would go back the next night, too. When Elvis returned from Munich, he made a number of lengthy phone calls to Anita Wood. But it was clear to Red and Lamar that he was outgrowing her. He also seemed less considerate of Elizabeth Stefaniak, who did everything she could to please him, even improving on his favorite snack, mashed banana and peanut butter sandwiches, by frying them in a skillet like a grilled cheese. In late March, Vernon and Elizabeth were hurt in a car crash on the Autobahn, returning from a shopping trip at the PX in Frankfurt. Vernon, driving the big Mercedes, attempted to pass another car when a vehicle pulled out in front of them. He slammed on the brakes, but the Mercedes fishtailed and spun out of control, rolling several times before slamming into a tree and landing on its roof. The car was a total loss. Elizabeth suffered head wounds from broken glass, and at first she couldn't move, fearing her back was broken. She arrived home on a stretcher. It was a terrifying ordeal, and both Elizabeth and Vernon might have been killed. But Elvis's reaction shook her up almost as much as the wreck. He raced out to the accident scene in his BMW, but later he took her aside. "Foghorn," he said, "be straight with me. Were you and my daddy messing around with each other while he was driving the car?" Vernon had no romantic interest in Elizabeth, but his relationship with Dee Stanley had escalated from a fling to a full-fledged affair. At first, Elvis and Vernon fought about it, and then Elvis realized that his father was lonely and needed company. "Bring her over to the house," he said. But when Vernon did arrive with Dee, they almost always disappeared into his bedroom, right off the living room. Elvis confessed to Anita Wood that he had once peeped through the keyhole. "I have hated Dee ever since then," he told Anita. Not only did the affair come too soon after Gladys's death, Elvis thought, but his father also embarrassed him with their antics. When Dee was in the throes of sexual pleasure, Lamar reports, she was not a quiet woman. When they started banging, Dee would start screaming. God almighty, she'd scream so loud you could hear her all over the house. Elvis would turn 16 shades of red. We'd be in the living room, and he would look at me and say, "I can't stand this, it's driving me crazy." Sometimes he'd just go upstairs, or Vernon would come out of the room about 20 minutes later, and he'd be real cocky, and he'd sit there. One time Elvis said, "Daddy, you need to take her in a car or take her out somewhere. Don't do it in here. Everybody in the house is hearing this." But it got worse and worse. One time they spent over an hour in there, and Elvis had about 15 people in the house. When Dee started to holler, Elvis got up and started playing the piano so damn loud it made Liberace sound like a paraplegic. He beat that piano to death, man. But the son had learned from the father. When Freddie Beanstalk arrived in Bad Nauheim a few months later to help Elvis pick songs for his first post-Army movie, GI Blues, he found himself in the middle of a Southern Gothic novel. He could hear both Elvis and his father having sex in the house. In June, after Dee had gone home to Virginia with her 3 sons, leaving her husband in Germany, Vernon followed her to persuade her to seek a divorce. The relationship had grown so serious that on this same trip, he drove her to Louisville to meet his father, Jesse. Then he returned to Germany and told Elvis they'd decided to marry. Red, too, left the country, going home about the same time for good. He had come to Germany with Elvis fresh out of the Marines, where he'd spent 2 years in Spain, and he was tired of military life. But he also complained that Elvis treated him like a Chinese coolie. Vernon, with whom Red was constantly at loggerheads over his temper and his habit of getting in fights at Beck's bar, gave Red and Lamar only a pittance in spending money, a couple of marks at best, barely enough for a beer, and Elvis refused to do anything about it. Around the time of his departure, Elvis was hospitalized with what was reported to be tonsillitis, though the inside story had it that he suffered carbon monoxide poisoning from a jerry-rigged heater in his Jeep. In Red's absence, Elvis got antsy for another of his pals from home, and instructed Lamar to call Cliff and tell him to get the hell over here. Cliff, being Cliff, accepted Elvis's plane ticket but took his time getting to Bad Nauheim, flying first to Paris to visit friends, and then going on to Munich and staying several weeks. "Where is the son of a bitch?" Elvis asked. Cliff finally showed up in Bad Nauheim and then took off in Elvis's Volkswagen. He was gone for a month. Eventually, he came back and announced, "I'm not going to stay around and shine some fucking shoes." He took Elvis's Mercedes 220 and moved in with Curry Grant, a clerk for Air Force Intelligence at Schierstein, near Wiesbaden, for 3 months. Soon, Curry and Cliff would be regular fixtures at the parties at the house, along with a smart Chicago street kid named Joe Esposito, part of the 27th Artillery. Joe, whose parents had immigrated to America from Calabria, Italy, was friends with the family of Tony Accardo, Chicago's last great mob boss. He was also a decent touch football player in Elvis's weekend games, and the man to see for a bit of loan sharking. That June, Elvis took off on a 15-day furlough that mixed a bit of business and sightseeing with a large sampling of sex. He first returned to Munich, where he checked into the Hotel Bayerischer Hof and spent his nights at the Moulin Rouge, making time with his favorite dancers, including one named Marianne, who demonstrated a strip routine wearing nothing but an Elvis record. Then, along with Rex, Lamar, and Charlie, he took the train from Frankfurt to Paris. There, Freddie Beanstalk and his cousin, Gene Auerbach, another of Elvis's music publishers in Hill and Range, met them at the station. Beanstalk and Auerbach, Austrian émigrés, knew Paris well and gave Elvis and his friends a tour of the Eiffel Tower and the Louvre. After that, they settled down to discussions of music for his upcoming films. Elvis, now influenced by European songs, wanted a larger, more operatic sound, and Elvis gave a press conference in the lounge of the Hotel Prince de Galles. A room service waiter told the press that during Elvis's stay in a top-floor suite overlooking the Champs-Élysées, young women were seen going in and out of Monsieur Presley's suite, in and out like a door revolving. In the day, Elvis was mobbed on the streets, which boosted his ego and eased his fears about being forgotten. At night, he enjoyed himself at the famous Parisian burlesque houses and nightclubs, Le Bantou, Le Folies Bergères, Carousel, the original Moulin Rouge, Le Café du Paris, and the Lido, with its famous semi-nude revue featuring the high-kicking, London-based Bluebell Girls, who performed the can-can in glittering clouds of sequins, ostrich feathers, voluminous headgear, and not a great deal else, as the New York Times once noted. When Elvis took the guys backstage after the first show, Rex was astonished to see girls roaming around naked. "Without batting an eyelash, I just about fainted at the sight," he said. Later, he learned that Elvis and Lamar had put the girls up to having a little fun with him. The Bluebell Girls, considered the most glamorous chorus line in Paris, inspired Elvis to indulge his friends in a smorgasbord of sex. "We went through the whole Lido chorus line," says Lamar. "Same thing at the 4 o'clock club. We'd have as many as 30 or 35 girls there. You'd get up in the morning and just step over bodies. There were wall-to-wall women everywhere." One late afternoon, the stage manager of the Lido called the hotel 3 times. Lamar answered, half asleep. "We are ready to begin the first show," the stage manager said. "Go ahead and start," Lamar told him, and then hung up. Shortly after, the phone rang again. "We need to start the show." Lamar hung up. A third call, frantic now. "The show is starting." "We'll start the damn show," Lamar said. "But you don't understand, monsieur. You have all our Bluebell girls." Lamar looked around and realized he was right. Not only were all the Bluebell girls in the suite, but they were also still asleep. Now, like a determined den mother, Lamar rounded up the guests and called downstairs for 4 limousines. Suddenly, the girls were a whirlwind of high heels and ostrich feathers, hopping down the hallway with one shoe on and trying to zip up their costumes. While in Paris, Elvis became especially enamored of dancer Jane Clark, a Brit, and Nancy Parker, a red-haired American ice skater at the Lido whom he would later see in Las Vegas. But his one disappointment was never meeting Bridget Bardot. According to Rex Mansfield, he managed to get her phone number and left several messages. But she never called back. She was out of the country making a movie. Nevertheless, Elvis felt snubbed, as though she should have been there for him. Rex wrote in his memoir, "To hell with that bitch," he said in his frustration. The sheer volume of women with whom Elvis had some kind of relationship, whether sexual or emotional, now bordered on the pathological. Waiting for him at home in Bad Nauheim, for example, was 23-year-old Ingrid Sauer, a blonde telephone operator who came to his parties and brought her friends. She also posed for tabloid photographers in only a towel and gave interviews as Elvis's girlfriend. His hobby is to see how many times he can get a pellet from an air pistol through the center hole of a gramophone record at 5 or 10 yards, she reported. But though Ingrid was only a year younger than the 24-year-old Elvis, she was too old for his tastes at the time. In Germany, Elvis was fascinated with the idea of real young teenage girls, which scared the crap out of all of us, Lamar says. One was 15-year-old Helly Primmel, a dancer Elvis nicknamed Legs. And perhaps another was 15-year-old Sigrid Schutz, an English-speaking German fan who spent practically every day of her 3-week summer vacation outside Elvis's house. Though he had hung a sign out front that read autographs 7:30 to 8 p.m., she frequently rang the doorbell and asked to see him. Some of the gate watchers, including USO hostess Sue Anderson, got invited in for more than an autograph. Sigrid, however, sometimes got a scolding, since she and a friend would sit waiting in one of Elvis's cars. Eventually, he took the zealous fan and her girlfriend to a party at the house of soldier Rex Harrison. After that, Sigrid saw Elvis often. She went with him and the gang to play football and was photographed with him more than any other German girl, both that summer and again in January 1960. She has been described as one of Elvis's secret loves, perhaps because she kept her dozens of photographs private for more than 30 years. However, none of the pictures was taken inside the house, which suggests she was not as intimate with him as some people think. And in the pictures of them together, Elvis looks mostly put upon, as if she has worried him to death. Elvis showed considerably more interest in another teenage girl he would meet that September. 19. Priscilla. On August 15, 1959, 14-year-old Priscilla Beaulieu arrived in Wiesbaden, Germany, where her stepfather, Air Force Captain Joseph Paul Beaulieu, was about to begin the next phase of his military career with the 1405 Support Squadron. A veteran of World War II, in which he'd served with the Marines in Okinawa, Captain Beaulieu had seen much of the world and nearly all of the United States. The family's last posting was Bergstrom Air Force Base in Austin, Texas, where Priscilla and her younger brother Don welcomed another 2 siblings, first Michelle and then Jeff. Twins Tim and Tom would be born later. An especially beautiful young child with China doll features and a turned-up nose, the blue-eyed brunette had been quite the popular girl in her junior high in Del Valle, Texas. A cheerleader, she knew all the latest dance crazes and was crowned queen of the whole school. More important, she had made real friends for the first time in the family's frequent moves. By the time she was 10, she had gone to 6 schools, from Connecticut to New Mexico, Texas to Maine, and back. "I knew this would be difficult for her," Captain Beaulieu said of the transfer, "but we had no choice." "I was crushed," Priscilla confirmed. "The last thing I wanted was to leave my friends and go off to some frozen foreign country." When Priscilla's stepfather brought home Elvis's first LP in March 1956, she liked the music, she said. She loved blue suede shoes, but as she would later say, she didn't want to be part of the Elvis mania. "In fact, I refused to join the Elvis fan club, admission 25 cents, when I learned that one member had asked Elvis to autograph her breast. In my preteen mind, that was too risque. On the other hand, I liked Elvis enough to want to watch him on the Ed Sullivan Show." Just before she left Texas, one of her schoolmates said, "Elvis is in the Army over there. Maybe you'll run into him." "Oh, sure," Priscilla replied. As she predicted, she was miserable in Germany and missed Austin terribly. She had no one to spend time with. She didn't really know the language, and her mother was occupied with a new baby. But 2 blocks away at Paulinenstrasse 7, she found an oasis at the Eagles Club, a pre-World War II mansion converted to an Air Force community hangout. There she whiled away the hours, listening to the jukebox and writing long letters to her friends back home. And then something extraordinary happened, she would later say. "One afternoon I was there with my little sister and brother when a serviceman happened to strike up a conversation with me. He was an especially nice guy who sensed that I was homesick. "Would you like to meet Elvis Presley?" he asked. "Who wouldn't like to meet Elvis?" I answered. I thought he was kidding, but he wasn't. His name was Curry Grant, and he said he and his wife often visited Elvis, who lived 45 minutes away in the town of Bad Nauheim. The meeting and courtship of 24-year-old Elvis Aaron Presley and 14-year-old Priscilla Ann Beaulieu is a beloved part of American cultural mythology. The handsome rock king grieving for his mother in a faraway land, the beautiful young princess, wise beyond her years, waving forlornly at his departure, only to become the virgin bride, conceiving on her honeymoon and bearing the great man's only child, a daughter, who at her father's untimely demise inherits the kingdom of Graceland. Such is the fairy tale romance of Elvis and Priscilla, as related by the woman so often mistaken for his widow. But as with the Camelot years of Jackie and John Kennedy, another couple who defines a generation, the truth has been rewritten and altered so many times that even many of the participants are not precisely sure what happened, or when, especially Priscilla. In her own book, Elvis and Me, Priscilla writes that when she saw Elvis on Jimmy and Tommy Dorsey's stage show, before even the Ed Sullivan Show, she was sexually attracted to him. She also says that when her friend Angela looked at a map and found that Bad Nauheim was close to Wiesbaden, Priscilla declared, "I'm going over there to meet Elvis." She was a girl on a mission then. Photographs show that she had taken it to such extremes, in fact, that after she read that Elvis was smitten with Deborah Paget, who everybody said she favored, she began wearing her hair in the exact style of Paget's in Love Me Tender, replete with long ringlet. It wasn't that Priscilla happened into a situation whereby she was invited to meet Elvis then, but according to Curry, an airman first class assigned to the 497th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron, she approached him at the Eagles Club. As he related in Suzanne Finstad's biography, Child Bride, The Untold Story of Priscilla Beaulieu Presley, it was about 5 o'clock, and he'd gotten a hamburger at the snack bar and taken it to the last table in the farthest corner so no one would bother him. Then he saw the door open and Priscilla enter. He'd barely gotten a bite down when she began walking toward him. "Hi," she said. "I understand you know Elvis." Curry was deflated. A married man who valued his wife and family more than anything, Laverne Curry Grant was also a sex addict, a fellow, as Finstead quoted him, just in overdrive when it came to sex. "I craved it all the time." He had no compunction about fooling around on his wife, and he had already seen Priscilla at the club and wanted her. He had hoped she wanted him too. But he played along, wondering how he could work it to his advantage. "Sure do," he said. "Well, I sure would like to meet him." "So would a lot of other girls, but sit down and we'll talk about it." Curry, a part-time manager of the Eagles Club, ran a weekly variety show called Hit Parade for the Air Force. He'd gotten to know Elvis through Cliff Gleaves, who Elvis had just brought over to Germany. Cliff, a sometime rockabilly singer, harbored dreams of becoming a stand-up comedian and promised Curry an introduction to Elvis in exchange for work. Once Cliff moved in with Curry and his wife Carol, he and Curry often frequented a swimming pool where Curry, a photographer, liked to take pictures of beautiful women. "And there," says Lamar Fike, "is where Curry and Cliff both met Priscilla after she had been in Germany for about a week and a half." Curry was taking pictures of her, Lamar says. Cliff described her to Elvis, and Elvis told Cliff to have Curry bring her over. No matter precisely how Priscilla and Curry first began talking about Elvis, everyone agrees on how she looked the night Curry and Carol picked her up for the drive from Wiesbaden to Bad Nauheim. She had on a blue and white sailor outfit, a midi blouse with a wide skirt over a crinoline, and white socks. It was Sunday, September 13th, 1959. Captain Beaulieu, who had met Curry and knew his commanding officer, had given his approval as long as Priscilla would be chaperoned. He reminded the Grants that she had classes the next day at the H. Arnold American Military High School, sponsored by the U.S. military, and that Priscilla should be home by midnight. She was nervous on the drive, but when they arrived at the house in Bad Nauheim, Priscilla drew on all her experience as Queen of Del Valle Junior High and transformed herself into a model of sophistication and mystery. The Grants passed by the predictable group of fans gathered at the gate and brought Priscilla into the house through the front door. Vernon was there, of course, as was Minnie May and Lamar and Elizabeth. They ran into Rex in the hall and introduced him to Priscilla. Elvis was in the living room wearing a red sweater and tan slacks, sitting leisurely in an armchair, a cigarillo dangling from his lips. Priscilla, who had waited for this moment since she was 10, stood tentatively behind Curry until he reached behind and took her hand. Then he pulled her up beside him. "Elvis," Curry said, "this is Priscilla." Curry had started to say more, but before he got it out, Elvis was on his feet. If you could have seen his face, Curry remembered in Child Bride. He jumped out of that chair like he was sitting on a hot plate. I had never seen him react to any girl like that, and I'd seen him meet at least 15 beautiful girls. He started bouncing off the walls. He asked her name, but out of nervousness, he already knew it. Curry had told him then, and Cliff had told him, and Lamar had even gone to check her out before Curry brought her to the house. I told Elvis, she's as cute as she can be, but God almighty, she's 14 years old. We'll end up in prison for life. I watched that from the very beginning with abject fear. Gladys had always told Elvis to beware of a blue-eyed girl, but now that he had seen her, there was no turning back. Petite, demure, dark-haired, with deep-set eyes, she so matched his ideal fantasy, as Finstead wrote, that it was as if he had designed her himself. Not only did she resemble Deborah Paget, his unrequited love, but as with Deborah, there was something about her face that matched his childhood memory of his mother when she was slim and vibrant. And, of course, at 14, she was almost certainly a virgin, another of Elvis's aphrodisiacs. She's young enough that I can train her any way I want, he later told Rex, practically bubbling over with enthusiasm. According to her memoir, Priscilla's account of that evening differs greatly from Curry's recollection. After Curry introduced them, the airman stepped away, leaving them alone, and she and Elvis sat down to get acquainted. He asked her if she went to school, and when she said yes, he said, "What are you, about a junior or senior in high school?" She blushed, she wrote, and said nothing, not wanting to reveal how young she really was. "Well?" he persisted. "Ninth." Elvis looked baffled. "Ninth what?" "Grade," she whispered. "Ninth grade?" he said and started laughing. "Why, you're just a baby." She was miffed, and he could see it. "Well," he said, "seems the little girl has spunk." Then he gave her that charming smile of his, she wrote, and all my resentment just melted away. They made small talk a little longer, and then he walked to the piano, playing Rags to Riches, Are You Lonesome Tonight, and End of the Rainbow, before launching into a hard-pounding Jerry Lee Lewis impersonation. She didn't applaud, she wrote, because she had noticed a life-size poster of a half-nude Brigitte Bardot on the wall, and she was the last person I wanted to see, with her fulsome body, pouting lips, and wild mane of tousled hair. It made her feel young and out of place. But quickly she noticed that Elvis vied for her attention, that the more disinterested she appeared, the harder he tried to impress her. He soon took her into the kitchen, where Grandma was frying up a pound of bacon, and Elvis devoured 5 bacon sandwiches, all slathered with mustard. As he ate, Priscilla was too on edge to think about food. He pumped her for information about who the kids were listening to back home. "You?" she said, because she could see he was nervous about losing his popularity. They talked about Fabian and Ricky Nelson for a while, and then he asked her about herself. "What kind of music do you like listening to?" he asked. "I love Mario Lanza." "You're kidding," he said, both because he loved opera and because Lanza was the uncle of Dolores Hart. "How do you know about Mario Lanza?" Priscilla told him she adored his album, The Student Prince. "That's my favorite," Elvis told her, and they just seemed to click. "He thought I had the taste of someone older than 14, she says. She could tell he missed his mother, missed Memphis, and was looking for a tie back to his fans in the States. And he seemed younger in his GI haircut. I found him extremely vulnerable and sweet. He had beautiful manners and an open heart. There was nothing false about him." All too soon, Curry came in and pointed to his watch. Couldn't she stay a little while longer, Elvis asked. Priscilla didn't take it as a sexual come-on, she said later, but rather a request of someone eager for companionship. But Curry said no, that he had made a promise to Captain Beaulieu. I felt like Cinderella, knowing that when my curfew came, all this magic would end, she wrote. Then Elvis casually mentioned that maybe she could come back another night. Though I wanted to more than anything in the world, she said. I didn't really believe it would happen. When Curry finally got her home, her parents were up waiting. Fog had delayed them another 2 hours, she said, but she assured her folks that Elvis was a total gentleman. The events of so long ago are often blurry in memory. While Priscilla was still there that first night, he walked into the kitchen alone to get a cold drink, Elizabeth would recall, and she could see he was enchanted. He had a glazed-over look, and he had everyone peek through the door at his guest, as if she were some exotic creature. "She looks just like a beautiful little angel, doesn't she?" he said to the room. Elizabeth agreed. She reminded me of a painting because she was flawless. From there, the story turns into a wildly diverging narrative, Curry Grant offering a far more candid and realistic rendering of the events than the sketchy details Priscilla recounts in her memoir. As reported in Child Bride, Elvis went back out into the living room, and when Curry and Carol walked out to join them 10 minutes later, he had Priscilla backed up against the wall kissing her. By 8:30, they were upstairs in his bedroom, according to several people in the house. Priscilla would confirm it many years later to Mike Edwards, a post-Elvis boyfriend, though her own book never mentioned such activity on the first night. He just took her by the hand, went upstairs, and said, "We'll be down later," Curry remembered in Child Bride, and she just went right with him. That's when Curry began to worry. He'd seen Elvis take many girls upstairs and then lose all track of time. It wasn't until 1 or 1:30 a.m. that they emerged, Elvis holding Priscilla's hand until she got to the steps. "Bring her back, Curry," Elvis said, and Curry, hurrying to get her into the car with Carol, called back, "I'll try." Then the nervous airman sped off to face Captain Beaulieu. When Priscilla left, Elvis continued to rave about her, telling Rex he had been looking for someone like that all of his life. Charlie Hodge and Joe Esposito, who both insisted they were there that night, though others disputed, reported similar statements from Elvis. "He looked at me and he said, 'Charlie, did you see the structure of her face? It's like everything I've ever looked for in a woman.' He was just enraptured looking at her." And to Joe, who agreed that she was so beautiful you could not take your eyes off her, Elvis said, "She's just unbelievable." Joe already understood his deeper meaning. Naturally, says Joe, he was attracted to women who reminded him of his mother, as Priscilla did, with the dark hair and the beautiful eyes like his mother had when she was young. That night, Elvis would transfer all of his symbolic feelings for his mother, his twin, and for Deborah Paget onto Priscilla. Later, he would tell her he knew at that moment that she was his twin soul, his destiny. "It's amazing to me the timing of Elvis meeting Priscilla," says Peter O. Whitmer. "Boom, Gladys dies. Elvis goes to Germany and puts Gladys's death as far behind him as he can. And then what happens? Bam! He runs into Curry Grant and Priscilla, and the dynamic has everything to do with Gladys's death." In a loose analogy, Whitmer explains, Elvis became Gladys to Priscilla's Elvis, in an attempt to replicate and work through his trauma. Subconsciously, Elvis would perform a lot of the functions for Priscilla that Gladys had performed for him, allowing him to fall back into a more relaxed state of mind. He found himself a little Elvis-like sylph, and he became the owner of it, the control of it, the mother, the father, the Holy Ghost, everything. But if it were a cosmic moment for Elvis, strangely, it was not the same for Priscilla. She did find him even more handsome in person than he appeared in his photographs and in the movies. However, she did not share Elvis's feelings of love at first sight, or that their meeting was the answer to a prayer. "No," she admitted later to Suzanne Finstad, There was definitely a pull there. The energy was very electric, but not in the sense that this is it. Many years later, she would see that their attraction was based on fantasy, each looking to the other to replace someone they had lost. It wasn't really Priscilla he was in love with, but an idealized manifestation of his yearning. And Priscilla may have only been 14, but she, too, had a giant void to fill. Only 1 year earlier, she had made a shattering discovery, as Finstad wrote in Child Bride, that threw her into an identity crisis she hardly knew how to handle. Born in Brooklyn, New York on May 24, 1945, Priscilla arrived in the world as a cross between Brooke Shields and John Benet Ramsey, an arresting and exquisitely beautiful child who seemed older than her years. Pampered by her mother, who entered her in baby contests and children's beauty pageants, she was soon an ultra-feminine, prissy child. The sort of little girl who would be in ruffles and lace and would lift the corner of her skirt to curtsy, says Suzanne Finstad, who interviewed her subject at length for her biography, Child Bride, first published in 1997. Priscilla was the perfect name for her. She was also a born coquette, Finstad wrote, projecting a sexual quality by 6 or 7 that was disturbing for one so young and beyond her ability to even understand what she conveyed. Her mother, Anne, a former photographer's model, fostered and reinforced her behavior, buying her showy cowgirl outfits and fancy dresses with coordinated purses, shoes, and hats. In the family's home movies, she waved to the camera and, tilting her head like a movie star, looked akin to a modern Shirley Temple. From the beginning, she was a relentless flirt with boys several grades ahead of her, but by 12 and a half, she was also attracting grown men, especially soldiers on the base. She worked at getting their attention, too. She was kind of like a little honeypot, said her Texas neighbor, Mary Clements, in Child Bride. She obsessed on her looks, opening her compact more than her school books, and manipulated situations with boys and men. She'd sit out on the lawn, for example, watching the older boys playing football, and watch them watching her. However, Priscilla's loveliness, and the way she used it to create an effect on others, was only the first of 4 interrelated molders of her personality. The second was the Air Force itself. In dictating that families were always on the move, military life created a lack of emotional security for children, who felt no sense of roots or permanence other than their ties to their parents and siblings. It was as if they were in the foxhole together. Growing up in a military family, Priscilla learned early to close ranks, to never get too close to outsiders. Since the military is always on the move, either her family would be moving or her friends' families, it would just be easier not to make attachments outside of the clan. Young Priscilla understood not to trust anyone outside of the service either, as the military runs on secrets. The family's unwritten rule dictated that it was better to suppress emotions then, especially since the military despises weakness and prizes control, and giving in to emotional displays and feelings could lead to a loss of that control. Priscilla had the very model of control right in her own home, in the form of her authoritarian military stepfather, Paul Beaulieu. The third integral influence on Priscilla's personality, Captain Beaulieu maintained a brutal, draconian presence in the household. A family member describes him as one tough dude, ruling the house with an iron fist and inspiring occasional terror in both his wife and his children. My father was very strict, Priscilla told an Amsterdam television interviewer in 1992. I'm hoping today we have a better way of bringing up our children. He was doing the best he could. He was very military, a disciplinarian. We were to be seen and not heard. We were to do as he said. It was kind of the old way, I think. Colonel Eugene de Saulnier, who served with Captain Beaulieu when he returned to the States in the 1960s, presents a different picture. In fact, the captain seems almost a different person in the eyes of his fellow officers. Known as Joe in the military and Paul at home, he was a great guy, a fun guy, says his friend. He was a very hard worker and committed to doing his job. but he was also very sociable and had a good personality. We used to have a lot of laughs at work. Captain Beaulieu, who would eventually retire as a lieutenant colonel, was a typical family man, according to Colonel de Saulnier. I think he was a little strict with his kids, but I wouldn't call him rigid. When you have children in the military and you are constantly moving them, it becomes even more important that you set some path for them to follow. Career military people work hard to keep their families together. It isn't like you live in the same neighborhood for 30 years, so you make your home life much more cohesive. I didn't think he was a heavy disciplinarian, but he made his kids toe the line. We all did. Priscilla grew up always wanting to please him, both to earn his praise and to mute her own fear, for Paul Beaulieu was said to be a heavy drinker, a fact he struggled to conceal from the world. Colonel de Saulnier questions that too, saying his friend was a very good social drinker, but I wouldn't ever characterize him as a hard drinker. In those days, we were all classified as hard drinkers. But when he did drink, the captain's attention sometimes made Priscilla uncomfortable, she told Elvis. He said Priscilla said her father gave her the creeps staring at her, Marty Lacker remembers. That would be enough of a psychological trauma for any young girl, but at age 13, Priscilla stumbled upon a family secret, which she discussed with Finstad in Child Bride. She was babysitting one night for her siblings while her parents were at a party. Once the children were asleep, she got bored and began snooping around, rummaging through things. In the back of her parents' closet, she found an old trunk and felt compelled to explore it. As she opened it, Priscilla told Finstad, I had this unbelievable feeling. The first thing she saw was an American flag, folded in the shape to present to widows of servicemen. It was a sacred thing, almost, not to be disturbed, like a grave, and Priscilla kept thinking, I shouldn't be doing this. She knew the trunk was private, that she shouldn't go any farther, but she did, of course, and under the flag she found a cache of yellowed love letters. She quickly flipped through them, fearing her parents would burst through the door any minute and catch her, and saw that they were between Rooney, her mother's nickname in her youth, and a boy named Jimmy. Her pulse raced, and as she dug inside the trunk for more, she found a stash of photographs of herself as an infant. She'd never seen them before. In some, she was alone. In others, she was with her mother. But in the most puzzling ones of all, her mother, holding baby Priscilla in her arms, stood next to a handsome, dark-haired stranger. Who was this man? The teenager turned the photo over, and there she read the words that nearly stopped her heart. Mommy, Daddy, Priscilla. Suddenly, as Finstad wrote, her whole life, a different life, one she had not known about, lay before her in the trunk. A birth certificate, baptism records, all with the last name of Wagner. It weighed on her so much that she called her mother at the party, and Anne Beaulieu rushed home to find her daughter hysterical, angry, and confused. Yes, she told her, she had been married to a Navy pilot named James Wagner. He was handsome and kind and loved Priscilla like nothing in this world, but he was killed in a crash when Priscilla was 6 months old. Several years later, Anne met and married Paul Beaulieu, and now he was Priscilla's father, having adopted her. Her mother hadn't told her before, she continued to Finstad, because Paul didn't want anyone to think Priscilla wasn't his natural daughter. He himself had almost come to believe that she was, so the lie had to be perpetuated. In fact, Finstad learned, the Beaulieus had cut Priscilla's paternal grandparents out of their life. It was as if Jimmy Wagner had never existed. Priscilla would remember it as a terrible moment, a life-changing moment, asserts Finstad, that completely unsettled Priscilla in every way. Her only anchors, the things she took for granted as her sense of constancy and identity, were suddenly demolished. She wasn't who she thought she was. That's an incredible kind of displacement, says biographer Finstad. Psychologists say that concealing information about a child's biological parents is one of the most damaging family secrets, rating just below incest. Priscilla, predictably, was highly upset to learn that her mother, The person she trusted most in the world to protect her had lied to her, and now she was being asked to be a co-conspirator in that lie, protecting her stepfather and shutting herself off from a set of loving, grieving grandparents who wanted nothing so much as to know the child who so resembled their son. At first, she told no one about the secret, but it was too much of a responsibility for a girl of her age, no matter how mature. Her only way to deal with it at the time, coming only months before the family's move to Europe, was to shut down emotionally, even as she was filled with rage and the need for attention. However, that did not mean that Priscilla did not act out. Her friends told Finstad they noticed a personality shift, mainly in her attraction to older boys, especially the hoodie kids, the tough, promiscuous crowd. Boys who already had cars and drank beer and spit in the face of authority. By 8th grade, she had a reputation for hanging with the wrong crowd. Once she got to Germany, she repeated her pattern, flirting with the black leather jacket boys and making poor grades. But more than before, as Finstad relates, Priscilla demonstrated two personalities, the good Priscilla and the naughty Priscilla. The latter was confident and assertive, especially where sex and seduction were concerned. In Curry's telling in Child Bride, when Priscilla approached him and told him she wanted to meet Elvis, she agreed to a Faustian pact. Curry had once taken another girl to Elvis's house, and she wanted nothing else to do with him once Elvis invited her to his bedroom. Curry was not about to have that happen again, and so the 27-year-old married man wanted to make sure he was alone with Priscilla before he would take her to meet Elvis. According to Curry, at first it was just kissing. He took her up into the hills around Wiesbaden. She concocted a story about going to the movies, and it was obvious she didn't want to do it. It was like kissing a table, Curry said in the Finstad book, and all she wanted to do was talk about Elvis. But eventually he wore her down, and she got into it a bit, and then he took her home. By their second visit to the hills that late August or early September 1959, she was more eager with him, though they held their activities to kissing and a little touching. On the third trip, she was more effusive. But on the fourth rendezvous, Priscilla succumbed to the married airman. It actually started getting better on the third, he said in Child Bride, but she did everything humanly possible to please me on that fourth time. It was then that Curry agreed to take her to meet Elvis, and by that time, he contends, she became a little aggressive herself. On the way back to her parents' house, Curry wanted her again and pulled his car over to a dark area near the Wiesbaden Museum. Her skirt was up and her blouse was open when a German police car pulled in behind them. Curry told Finstad he feared he'd go to prison. She was a minor, and her father was an officer in the Air Force. But the German cop let him off with an admonishment. You'd better be careful and take her on home when you get ready. Priscilla denies Curry's account, in a classic case of he said, she said. Curry would say later that Priscilla had not bled when he penetrated her, leading him to believe that she had already had intercourse, perhaps with one of the older, bad boys she ran around with in 8th grade. Later, he decided that probably wasn't right. She seemed so inexperienced at lovemaking. The bottom line, if Curry's account is to be believed, and from what Priscilla's schoolmate, Tom Stewart, told her biographer, Suzanne Finstad, about his own sexual relationship with Priscilla in 1959, is that in 1967, when Elvis and Priscilla married, she was not the virgin bride that Elvis always said he wanted. She was not even a virgin on the night he first met her. When writing her biography of Priscilla, Finstad interviewed both Curry and Priscilla and found their versions of the story at great variance. Hoping to reconcile their accounts, Finstad arranged to interview the two of them together. Presented with Curry's story, Priscilla became hysterical. "May God strike me dead if that ever happened to me," Finstad quotes her as saying. "I am telling you on the life of my son and my daughter that never happened. That man is a liar." But by Priscilla's later account to her then-boyfriend, Mike Edwards, related in Child Bride, she did have some kind of episode with Curry in the German hills that led to her meeting Elvis. In 1998, Priscilla sued Curry for defamation, arguing in her legal action that his statements were fabrications. She and her attorney sought $10 million in damages. In August of that year, Los Angeles Superior Court Judge Daniel Curry entered a default judgment against Curry for libel and ordered him to pay $75,000, far less than the $10 million Priscilla sought. Neither Finstad nor her publisher, Harmony Books, Crown, were ever sued. Priscilla used the default judgment to make it appear that the information that Curry provided was tainted. While there is a default judgment against Curry on file, there is also a confidential settlement agreement, a secret arrangement dated August 11, 1998, between Curry and Priscilla that underlies and supersedes the default judgment. In the private side letter agreement, apparently prepared by Priscilla's attorneys, Curry is not required to pay Priscilla a dime as long as he does not repeat his accusations or disclose the existence of the secret settlement. According to the settlement, he and Priscilla agree not to discuss each other in public, other than a statement from Priscilla in which she says she feels vindicated. In exchange, Priscilla does not enforce the default judgment against Curry and pays him $15,000 for pictures he took of her in Germany. The confidential side letter states, "The parties stipulate and agree that the parties can state to the media that a judgment for defamation has been entered in favor of Presley against Grant. No mention will be made by Presley or her attorneys to the media of the dollar amount of the judgment. Presley can state to the media that she feels vindicated by this result. Grant will make no comment to the media other than the fact that Grant is glad to move on. Furthermore, the parties stipulate and agree that Grant will no longer state to the media or any other individual that he had sex with Presley, and Presley will no longer state to the media that Grant attempted to rape her." Per the side letter, Curry must pay a minimum of $75,000 if he engages in any prohibited communications regarding Priscilla. Clearly, Priscilla has taken extraordinary measures to silence Curry, presumably to protect the myth of how she met Elvis and whether she was a virgin at the time. When Curry brought Priscilla back to Elvis's house a second time, he knew that Elvis would waste no time in taking her upstairs. A few days after Priscilla's first visit, Curry voyeuristically pressed her for details of what had happened that first night. Elvis was sweet and tender with her, she told Curry. They lay on the bed and he kissed her gently, and then things got a little hotter. "He just played with her," Curry told Finstad. "He was doing the hand thing. He was feeling her up, so to speak. He went under with his hand very slowly, rubbing the skin, rubbing across her chest, stuff like that, and telling her to relax, that he wasn't going to hurt her, talking to her like she was a kid, which of course she was." Priscilla was only too eager to please Elvis, and she complied. At first, she just listened while he talked. To a background of sad music on the radio, Elvis shared his heart, telling her of his insecurities about keeping his fan base, talking again of his grief over losing his mother, and confessing how disappointed he was that his father was involved with another woman so soon after his mother's death. He seemed not only to trust Priscilla, but also to speak to her as if she were his age. That night, they forged an integral psychological bond. If Priscilla became a projection of everything Elvis wanted and couldn't have, as Finstad wrote in her biography, he would become a stand-in for the lost and romanticized Jimmy Wagner. Elvis also offered her an escape from her complicated relationship with her stepfather, even as Elvis would quickly replicate the captain's control. Eventually, she would tell Elvis the family secret. "I felt more comfortable with him and had more trust in him," she would say about that second night. "I felt that he was a trustworthy person that I could depend on." And perhaps that was part of the reason why Elvis was able to get as far as he did on Priscilla's second visit to his bedroom. Priscilla didn't want to tell Curry about it when he asked for a running report of their activities, but he controlled her fate with Elvis. She was dependent on him to take her back to the house. Plus, she needed someone to talk with about her situation. She was 14 years old and playing adult games with an international film and music star. According to Curry, Finstad wrote, when he demanded the details, "Don't play coy with me." She told him everything. How Elvis had her blouse and bra off, how his hands were going everywhere, and how he started to get under her dress. As her nights with Elvis continued, Curry would insist on hearing about the intimacies on the very night they occurred. But Priscilla would want to know what he knew too, particularly about the other girls. Not only would Elizabeth Stefaniak crawl into Elvis's bed after Priscilla left, not necessarily for sex, Joe Esposito offers, but sometimes 15-year-old Helly Primmel would be leaving Elvis's bedroom when Priscilla arrived. And one night, she had sneaked a peek at Anita Wood's letters and knew that Elvis was heavily invested at home. Her competition was keen, and she needed Curry to both quell her anxiety and help her level the playing field. However, on one of their drives back to Wiesbaden, Curry told Finstad he became excited at Priscilla's recounting and pulled off the Autobahn for a quick assignation. He tried to kiss her, and she resisted, and then he fondled her breast, and she wriggled away. Finally, he quit. It was the old syndrome. She'd been up in the bedroom with Elvis, and so she didn't need him. Priscilla would describe the event to Finstad as more of an attempted rape. "I was terrified. I did everything in my power to keep him off me. There was a house there, and I was going for that. I kicked doors open and blew horns." When the lights came on in the house, it scared Curry, she said, and he stopped. "She told no one, because I thought I wouldn't see Elvis anymore." And she had to see Elvis again. But she later said to Finstad that when Curry tried to rape her a second time, taking her by the Rhine River, she told her parents and Elvis what had happened. Her parents had become concerned about her friendship with Elvis, they said, when Elvis started calling her. Priscilla talked about him every minute at home, too, and suddenly the captain needed some answers. "I don't think he was prepared to know what was going to happen, because I only went for a visit," Priscilla has said. "But I just kept visiting and visiting, and then we started to fall in love. I visited a lot, but it was always with other people, and there were parties. In my father's mind, there were always a lot of people, and I wasn't the only one Elvis was seeing. When you are a parent, you never really see the full picture. And when you are a child, you don't really give the full picture." Captain Beaulieu insisted that Elvis come to the house before Priscilla would be allowed to see him again. Elvis agreed, and when he arrived, he wasn't alone. "I'm Elvis Presley," he said, "and this is my father, Vernon." "I enjoyed speaking with Elvis and was impressed with his manners," the captain said in 2005. "Anyone would be. He seemed impressed by my military service and asked a number of intelligent questions about my work. All this was fine, but at a certain point I had to ask him, why my daughter, with millions of women throwing themselves at you, why Scylla?" His answer was straightforward. "I feel comfortable talking to her," he said. "She's more mature than her age, and don't worry, I'll take good care of her." I concluded that he was genuine, and now I am absolutely certain that I came to the right decision. And Beaulieu felt the same. When we met Elvis that first time, our entire outlook changed. She said in a documentary DVD, "I'd never met such a polite young man. He addressed my husband as sir or captain. He addressed me as ma'am. He was soft-spoken and sincere. You couldn't help but like him. He treated us with complete respect." As Joe Esposito observed, Elvis could talk anyone, particularly female, into anything. But there were other reasons, perhaps, why Priscilla's mother was so willing for her to attach herself to Elvis, as Finstad wrote in Child Bride. Anne had been only 15 when she snuck out to see another handsome, dark-haired serviceman, Jimmy Wagner, at the USO. And there was another factor. Anne loved it that her daughter was seeing a celebrity, as if some of his stardust would rub off on Priscilla and on her as well. Anne had always dreamed of a career in show business, perhaps as a dancer, if not an actress. In fact, Anne had become infatuated with Elvis while watching the Ed Sullivan Show. The surprise then was that she didn't just let Priscilla go to see Elvis. She encouraged it, in part to live vicariously through her daughter. When Curry first spoke with the Beaulieus about getting permission to take her to the house, he told Finstad, "It was not a question of if Anne would let Priscilla go," he said. "It was rather a question of when I would take her." The Beaulieus had to have known what eventually would happen with a 24-year-old man and a 14-year-old girl who kept such close company. But Elvis assured them they were just playing music. Priscilla wrote in her autobiography that she begged Elvis to consummate our love before he left Germany, and that he refused to do it. But in this case, consummation becomes a matter of semantics. Elvis's young visitor was apparently not sexually shy in the slightest. Joe Esposito remembers Elvis telling him, "She's a beautiful girl. I wouldn't lay a hand on her. But to have her sit on your face?" On the third or fourth nights, the temptation got to be too much, and after the tickling and the teasing and the kissing, Elvis and Priscilla had intercourse, she told Curry, and not just once. But Elvis didn't consider it going all the way, because he would pull out before he felt that they had consummated the relationship. That way, in his mind, she was still untouched. But in time, Elvis would tell members of his entourage that, indeed, he and Priscilla had had sex in Germany, and Priscilla would later confirm it to Billy Smith's wife, Jo. Once that behavior began, Priscilla returned to Goethestrasse 3 or 4 nights a week, becoming a part of the group that regularly congregated at the house. With such hours, it took everything she had to keep from falling asleep in class, and Elvis began slipping her pills to keep her awake. She swore she didn't take them, though, only keeping them in a box with her other Elvis souvenirs. "I was leading 2 lives," she said. "Ninth grader by day, Elvis's girl by night." After each visit, Curry or Lamar or Joe would drive Priscilla home. In dreadful weather, the 45-minute drive would take far longer, and they would sometimes get her home at 2 or 3 in the morning, far after her curfew. Instead of a dressing down, however, they received only pleasantries from her parents. Priscilla could hardly get up for school the next morning, but all her mother would say, Curry told Finstad, was, "What time do you want her ready the next time?" Priscilla was right to worry about Anita Wood. Late that fall, while out on winter maneuvers in Bavaria's Waldflecken, where he spent 30 days sleeping out on the ground, often in snow, Elvis wrote Anita a 4-page letter. Postmarked November 6, 1959, it was the last of 3 letters Elvis wrote her during his military service, and it was by far the most revealing, as he rolled out in frank terms his homesickness, mother need, and hormonal desire. He addressed her as, "My dearest darling little," and began by saying how miserable he was out in the field. He was down with a fever and tonsillitis again, he wrote, and listening to the radio. His only consolation was that his tour of duty was almost over, and he would soon come home to his career, friends, and most of all you, darling. His reason for writing, he told her in well-thought-out paragraphs, was that he was worried about how she might react when he did return home. He didn't know how she felt about him now. He said, "Because after all, 2 years is a long time in a young girl's life." It was a curious choice of words, considering that Anita would turn 21 in May and was nearly a woman, while 14-year-old Priscilla was clearly a child. His words suggest that he was melding them emotionally in his mind. But on the surface, he seems concerned that Anita may have gotten older and wiser, and that she might have moved on. Whether Elvis wrote the letter as much to make up his own mind between his 2 loves, he spent the majority of it declaring his love for Anita and apologizing for things she might have read or heard. He also said that he had the feeling she had cooled on him, not only because she hadn't written to him, but also because of the sound of her voice on the phone. "The warmth and love seems to have dimmed," he said. "I want you to know that in spite of our being apart, I have developed a love for you that cannot be equaled or surpassed by anyone. My every thought is you, my darling. Every song I hear, every sunset reminds me of the happy and wonderful times we've spent together. I tell you this because I want you to know my feelings toward you have not changed, but instead has grown stronger than I ever thought it could. I have hurt you sometimes because I was mad at some of the things you did, or I thought you did, but every time these things happened, I thought that maybe you only liked me for what I am, and didn't really love me for myself. The fact remains, if it's really love, Anita, if we really love each other, it will last, although things will come up in the future that will hurt us both. They are to be expected. Please believe me when I tell you it's you and only you, my darling. But I think that you will keep our word and tell me if you have grown to care for someone else and vice versa. Darling, I pray that you haven't let your loneliness, passions, and desires make you do something that would hurt me. If you have, it is better you tell me now. I can't believe you have or would. So, darling, if you still feel the same and if you love me and me alone, we will have a great life together, even though you hear things and read things. Just think, as you said, everyone knows how I feel about you. I can't explain to you how I crave you and desire your lips and your body under me, darling. I can feel it now, the things we did and the desire we had for each other's body. Remember, darling, true love holds its laurels through the ages, no matter how loud the clamor of denial. That which deserves to live, lives. Yours alone, E.P. In challenging Anita to keep our word about growing to care for someone else, Elvis breaks his word in not being truthful with her about Priscilla. Anita had read about her in the papers, and he assured me that this was a child, a 14-year-old child. While she considered this letter from Elvis to be a little cruel, she says, I had been a little cruel to him. If he really thought that Anita might leave him, it would have been a grave concern, particularly now that he was returning to Graceland for the first time since his mother's death. His letter suggests that his real intention in writing was to secure Anita as a backup, that he was making certain he had, literally, a warm body awaiting his return from frozen, frosty Deutschland. Elvis's psychological set would have mandated a backup, in case he had trouble with Captain Beaulieu, for his relationship with Priscilla had to feel tenuous, given her age and the fact that she would remain in Germany when he went home. If Priscilla were the new obsession, Anita was a known entity, comfort food for the mind, a distant, parsed-off reality that in Elvis's mind smelled, felt, reeked of home, Gladys, Memphis, and stardom, says psychologist Whitmer. Whatever carnality the two of them had enjoyed, that too would be exponentially magnified. Elvis's reference to 2 years being a long time in a young girl's life may also have been his subconscious and accurate assessment of the time it would take to get Priscilla to Memphis. Yet given the malleable mind of a 14-year-old, Elvis must have sensed that he was in the catbird seat in being able to mold her during those years, even from afar. That Christmas, he arranged for a French poodle to be delivered to Anita, while at a party at Goethestrasse for his family and friends. He had Priscilla sit next to him at the piano as he sang, I'll Be Home for Christmas. She was furious with him. When he started to switch to guitar, he nonchalantly asked 2 English girls where his pick was. One of them told him its precise location. It's upstairs on the table right beside your bed, she answered, smiling. I'll get it. Priscilla, who'd given Elvis a pair of bongo drums for Christmas, knew he had betrayed her once more. But he denied it, explaining that he'd mentioned how unkempt his bedroom was, and the girl had merely offered to clean it for him. Priscilla didn't believe him, but now, at the piano, when he leaned over and gently kissed me, when he told me I was the one, the only one, when I saw tears in his eyes, nothing in the world mattered but our love. Nothing mattered but him. When Elvis returned from winter maneuvers, he contacted a South African doctor named Lawrence Johannes Greisel Landau, who advertised herbal skin treatments to reduce acne scars and enlarged pores. Elvis, who had pores big enough to hide a tank in, as Lamar put it, fretted about how he looked in his close-ups on screen, and began weekly treatments with the doctor. but their association came to an end when the dermatologist, who turned out not to have a medical degree at all, made inappropriate advances to Elvis during a procedure. He eased his hand down between Elvis's legs and gave him a good squeeze, Lamar remembers, and boy, Elvis jumped 30 feet up in the air. Elvis told him to get out, that his work was finished. But Landau was not so easily dismissed. He had tape recordings and pictures of Elvis and a young girl in intimate situations, he said, and he threatened to expose them. Panicked, Elvis gave Landau enough money to relocate to London. Then he called the colonel, who recommended that he go to the Army's Provost Marshal Division, which referred the case to the FBI. It never occurred to Elvis to end his inappropriate relationship with Priscilla, however, nor to curtail his activities with the dancers and strippers at the clubs. In early January 1960, just after his 25th birthday, he returned to Paris for 6 days with Cliff, Lamar, and Joe, acting as his new friend's tour guide in the romantic city. Joe, at Vernon's request, would keep tabs on the expenditures, a job he would do well, impressing not only Vernon and Elvis, but also their accountant back in Memphis. "We just played all night and slept during the day," Joe remembers. "Well, I'll tell you it's a gay town, if you like nightlife and everything," Elvis would soon remark to Armed Forces Radio. They stayed in the penthouse at the George V Hotel and hit all of Elvis's usual night spots, taking in the drag show at Le Bantu. Elvis had enjoyed an encounter with a female contortionist in Frankfurt one night. He stayed in that dressing room 5 or 6 hours, came out of there wringing wet, Lamar says, but he kept his distance from the impersonators. Lamar and Cliff had already gotten burned, and he didn't want to be next. Elvis had a more legitimate reason for going to Paris, to further his new study of karate. "It gave him permission to be a badass," says Lamar. For the last month, he had been taking lessons twice a week from Jürgen Seidel, the father of German karate. Elvis had been fascinated by martial arts since 1957, when Tura Santana mentioned their influence on her strip act and showed him some of the moves. Only recently, he had read a magazine article about Hank Slamansky, the ex-Marine who introduced the sport into the armed services. Seidel saw how serious Elvis was about it and recommended that he take classes from the Japanese instructor Tetsuji Murakami in Paris. Within days of returning to Germany, he was promoted to acting sergeant, and after another round of maneuvers, he threw a party to celebrate his forthcoming transfer. His Army experience was finally coming to an end. On March 3, 1960, he would be on his way home, flying into Fort Dix, New Jersey. "They thought I couldn't take it, and I was determined to go to any limits to prove otherwise," he told Armed Forces Radio. Now he began making real plans to resume his old life in the States. Joe Esposito would go to work for him when they got home, and Elizabeth had agreed to come to Graceland to be his secretary, with occasional trips to Hollywood. Elvis hoped Rex Mansfield would also join the group as his road manager, and he would talk with him about it on the train heading home to Memphis. They had walked every step of their Army hitch together, from the first day to the last. Looking back on it all, he defined his time in the service as a blessing in disguise. "It was a time of grief for me. It came at a time when I sorely needed a change. God's hand at work. The Army took me away from myself and gave me something different." On March 1st, the day before his departure, the military held a press conference for its celebrity sergeant. More than 100 reporters and photographers attended, capturing Elvis's every word and gesture as his commanding officer presented him with the Certificate of Merit for cheerfulness and drive and continually outstanding leadership ability. Nobody but Joe Esposito knew that at that very moment, Elvis had 1,200 pills packed in his luggage, a box of 12 bottles with 100 pills in each one. In Paris, we'd be out partying all night, then get up and take one of those little pills, and it was great. Elvis was the type who thought you never take just one, because 2 was even better. Before he left the press conference that day, Elvis ran into an old friend, someone he hadn't seen since her enlistment in 1957. He hadn't even known she was in Germany. It was Marion Keisker, his mentor from Sun Records, who still insisted that she, and not Sam Phillips, had really discovered him. She was assistant manager of Armed Forces Television there, a captain under her married name, McInnes. She caught him just as he was coming in the door, flanked by MPs. It was like they were taking him to the gallows, she thought. He stepped through and I said, "Hi, hun," and he turned around and his jaw fell. He said, "Marion, you're in Germany and an officer?" I knew he didn't know. He said, "Do I kiss you or salute you?" I said, "In that order." There I was in my uniform, and he was in his uniform, and I just flung myself on him. But the only girl he was really thinking of was Priscilla. The countdown to his departure had been hell for both of them, and they clung to each other on that final day, first at the house and then on the ride to the airbase. The night before, he told her for the first time that he loved her. "We swore undying fidelity," she says, but underneath she was a massive insecurity. What was I to think? What was I to believe? He was going back to America where he was the biggest star. He was going back to making music and making movies. He was going to appear on the Frank Sinatra special. Where did all this leave me? She tried not to worry too much. Hadn't he given her his combat jacket and his sergeant stripes? "Little one," he said softly, "these prove you belong to me." Then he got out of the car, waved cheerfully to the crowd, and boarded the plane. "He was in love with Priscilla, no two ways about it," says Joe. And it showed. The photographers figured out who she was and snapped her picture as he waved directly to her. Priscilla offered a lonely wave in return, and even in her sorrow, with a scarf wrapped around her head to keep the March wind at bay, her face rivaled that of a Hollywood starlet. She didn't smile, but she didn't cry either. She kept her famous family reserve. And then he was gone. But there was a postscript to the story, and it involved Curry Grant and how Suzanne Finstead knew that he was telling the truth in the he said, she said account. After Curry had attacked her in the car the second time, Priscilla told Finstead, her parents banned Curry from ever coming anywhere near her. Elvis, too, declared he was no longer part of the group, according to Priscilla. But Curry argued that Priscilla was wrong, that he was still very much a part of the inner circle. Finstead arranged to interview them together face-to-face and to record the conversation with their permission. Curry said he brought Priscilla to the airbase the day that Elvis flew back to the States. He and Carol had picked her up at her house. "You think my father would let you pick me up at the house?" Priscilla countered angrily, as Finstead reported in Child Bride. "He was glad to let me pick you up that day," Curry mocked. "A life cameraman took all the pictures around my car. I'm standing outside, holding the door. Priscilla, you don't remember that, huh? You've got something up there that's really blocking your memory." Priscilla soon left, insisting Curry was in a dream world. Finstead had a scientist, Ray Gunther, put the tape of their conversation through a personality stress evaluator, or PSE, a computerized voice stress test considered more accurate than a polygraph, and used by police departments all over the United States. In evaluating 28 points in Curry and Priscilla's dispute, Gunther concluded that Curry was telling the truth 100% of the time, and that Priscilla was deceptive in all but one of her statements, an innocuous one about how Curry originally introduced himself. Finstead also discovered that Curry had an almost photographic memory for details. He had even remembered the make, model, and license plate number of the car that he was driving at the time. In the course of her research, Finstead found a German magazine, Film Journal, from 1960. The publication chronicled Elvis's last day in the country in a minute-by-minute account, replete with a little clock in each photograph. There in the magazine was a picture of Curry opening the door of his 1955 Chevrolet Bel Air for Elvis and Priscilla. Not only did the license plate number match what Curry had told her, but so did the hour. "It was literally the smoking gun," says Finstead. "I didn't care which one was telling the truth. I simply wanted to know what really happened." In her opinion, Curry's story doesn't in any way tarnish Priscilla, she adds. It just makes her more human. She was like every other teenage girl in the world, desperate to make Elvis Presley her own.